Dorne had always prided itself on standing apart from the rest of the Seven Kingdoms, its sun-scorched deserts and proud traditions shielding it from the impulses of the North, the Reach, and beyond. It was there, in the ancient seat of Sunspear, beneath tapestry-draped ceilings and amid the scent of lemons and spiced wine, that a fragile new dream took root. Prince Doran Martell, with his deliberate gait and quiet gaze, had never been one to chase glory in battles or jousting fields. Instead, he had labored for years with patient cunning, weaving alliances, nurturing secrets, and planning for a day when House Martell might stand at the center of a peaceful realm. In his youth, he had seen too much blood spilled for the Iron Throne, watched his brother's fiery spirit consumed by the thirst for vengeance. Oberyn had demanded the heads of those who wronged their sister, but Doran had always believed there might be a more enduring solution than an unending cycle of war and retribution. Now, older than the wars that had battered Westeros, older than the memories of Robert Baratheon's rebellion, he saw an opportunity that even he had hardly dared to imagine. A truce among all the great houses, a settlement that might finally still the trembling ground beneath the Seven Kingdoms. It began with letters. Sealed with a golden sun and spear, they were dispatched to every corner of Westeros. Ravens flapped their wings over the red mountains, across the storm-lashed seas, to the stony crags of the Vale, and even north of the Neck. No one spoke of it openly at first. Noble lords read the contents behind closed doors, conferring with maesters and confidants, but word soon spread that the Prince of Dorne called for a parley. A grand convocation in Sunspear, open to representatives of every major house, with the promise of safe passage guaranteed. At first many scoffed. Why should any of them kneel to the will of Doran Martell, who had spent so many years behind palace walls? Hadn't the might of the Lannisters reigned supreme from the Red Keep? Or the cunning of Littlefinger cast webs across the realm from the Eyrie? But the war-weary lords of Westeros, still nursing wounds from rebellions, invasions, and the War of the Five Kings, found themselves eager for any whiff of stability, if only to buy time to regroup. So one by one they entertained the prince's invitation. Some with scorn, some with genuine curiosity, but all with a growing sense that perhaps the tide of war might, for a season, ebb. Prince Doran, sitting in his solar with one leg elevated to ease the incessant ache of gout, watched as the replies trickled in. The Archmaester's records would one day show that never before had so many houses agreed to gather in Dorne under a banner of peace. Yet he did not delude himself into thinking all hearts were pure. He knew well that there would be spies, hired blades, and silent threats draped in silks and cloaked by courtly pleasantries. He could almost taste the tension that would fill the air. But tension might be harnessed. So he sent clear instructions to every guard in Sunspear. Any who entered would lay aside their swords at the gates. This alone caused uproar. A Targaryen traveling from Dragonstone would be loath to appear unarmed, though the Targaryens who remained had no dragons to speak of. A troubling sign of the diminishing fabled might of their house. The Lannisters, with their golden hair and fierce pride, would surely balk at discarding their swords even for a moment. The remnants of House Tyrell, left adrift after so many tragedies, might comply, but they would do so with reluctance. And what of the North? The Starks, battered but unbroken, might accept any sign of potential peace. Yet there was talk in the wind that a Stark now sat in Winterfell once more, recovering from some legendary ordeal. Would they come at all? The day dawned hot and glaring when the first of the delegates arrived in Sunspear. Dornish spears stood in crisp formation at the harbor, as sleek galleys with colorful sails glided into port. Merchants and small folk gathered around the harbor's edges, their curiosity piqued by the promised spectacle. Few days in Dorne had ever seen so many foreign crests flapping in the breeze. The Black Stag of Baratheon, the Golden Lion of Lannister, the Direwolf of Stark, the Mockingbird of Baelish, the Silver Trout of Tully, the Falcon of Arryn, each a testament to how thoroughly the realm had fractured, a living tapestry of countless allegiances. The heat pressed down, drenching travelers in sweat, and the gulls shrieked overhead. But none turned back. They had all come too far to retreat. Prince Doran personally greeted no one at first, sending his nephew Quentyn and niece Arianne in his stead. The pair stood with practiced poise outside the old palace, their fine Dornish garb shimmering in the sun's glare. Arianne wore her hair unbound, her jewels reflecting the bright light, smile practiced yet inscrutable. Quentin, not nearly as flamboyant, managed to appear respectful and cautious, offering the right gestures of honor to each new arrival. For a time, it was an orderly affair of greeting lines and ceremonial welcomes. Then the tension escalated when the Lannisters arrived. Jaime, who was no longer the Golden Knight of yore but a man tempered by losses and regrets, and a retinue of lesser cousins, for Cersei was rumored to be in seclusion in the Red Keep. Some said she was mad. Others claimed she was under house arrest by her own son, King Tommen, who had not come in person but sent emissaries under the Lion's banner. Jaime demanded the security of his own men. Arianne refused with a sweetly curved smile, pointing to a table where an official took note of every blade, from short knife to longsword. Jaime's jaw twitched in frustration, but remembering the precarious position of his house, he unclasped his golden sword belt. It took the Lannister guards several heated moments to comply, their hands trembling on their hilts. But, at last, they surrendered steel. Next arrived Sir Bronn, sporting the colors of House Stokeworth these days, with a flippant swagger that made the Dornish guards frown. He parted with his weapons with exaggerated reluctance, making a show of how heavily he relied on them. Yet to everyone's surprise, he complied as well. Thus from the highest lords to the lowest hedge knights, the might of the realm gathered in the winding corridors of Sunspear, unarmed, and at the mercy of Doran Martell's hospitality. Rumors buzzed like wasps in the castle gardens. Some spoke of secret alliances. Others whispered that the Sand Snakes might be the hidden fists behind every tapestry, ready to strike. But day after day, no violence erupted. When at last Prince Doran emerged, leaning on a staff capped with a small golden spear, he moved with a regal composure that contrasted sharply with his guests' unease. They were gathered in the old palace's grand hall, a chamber with arches that opened to the sea breeze, letting in the crashing sound of waves. Doran's voice, though soft, carried across the vaulted ceiling. He welcomed them to Sunspear, remarking on how, though it was a harsh land, Doran had endured centuries of threats from beyond its red mountains. Perhaps because of that, the Dornish understood the price of a fragile peace better than most. He made no grand speeches about alliances or marriage pacts. Instead, he spoke simply of the realm's exhaustion, of how the endless wars had sown nothing but famine and distrust, and how each house had more to gain from a stable kingdom than from a continuing spiral of bloodshed. His words were measured, delivered without dramatics. And yet they held a certain gravity, for every person there had seen war's cruelty firsthand. But forging peace was not the work of a single day. The lords and ladies broke into small circles to talk over cooled wine, lemon water, and platters of spiced olives, stuffed dates, and roasted peppers. Prince Trystane Martell, Doran's youngest son, did his best to entertain those of similar age with courtesy, though grief for Myrcella Lannister still haunted him. Arianne flitted between clusters of knights, forging private accords with coy smiles. Oberyn's daughters, the Sand Snakes, glided through the halls like living shadows. Each had her own cunning, her own style of approach, Nymeria with her lethal grace, Tyene with sweet piety masking sharper edges, and so on. They were living proof of Doran's unpredictability. Yet, at Doran's command, they tempered their thirst for vengeance, at least for the moment. Rarely had a gathering of so many sworn enemies proceeded without bloodshed, but there they stood, each uncertain if the others might truly be sincere. On the second day of the gathering, a hush spread when a small retinue approached by land. The sigil was unmistakable, a red three-headed dragon on a black field. The Targaryen who led them was Aegon, rumored to be the long-lost son of Prince Rhaegar, who many in Westeros believed had perished as a babe at the sack of King's Landing. Dark-haired, with a calm confidence, he had a princely bearing, though the legitimacy of his claim had been hotly contested. He was accompanied by a handful of Golden Company knights. Once Dorne had pledged itself to the Targaryens through Elia Martell's marriage to Rhaegar. That union had ended in tragedy, and the resentment that festered was enough to set the realm ablaze. Yet Aegon's arrival here, in the land that had once been the Targaryens' staunchest ally, carried an air of poetic justice or deep suspicion. Lips pressed together. Eyes narrowed. Yet none raised a sword, for the gates to Sunspear had made them all unarmed. The Targaryen entourage, too, relinquished their swords without complaint, the Golden Company's captain flaring his nostrils but yielding nonetheless. For days, the talks continued in an uneasy swirl of alliances, feigned courtesies, and half-whispered threats. Prince Doran supervised it all from behind the scenes, staying no more than a few hours in the hall each day before retreating to his solar. There, letters were drafted, rumors weighed, and alliances tested. He allowed the delegates to circle each other like wary animals in a clearing, sniffing for danger, forging ephemeral pacts. His patience was remarkable. Many suspected him of some hidden motive. But what if his motive was truly at last peace? At length, a grand feast was planned, ostensibly to celebrate the longevity of the gathering, that not a single life had been lost so far. The wide courtyard of the old palace was strewn with Dornish carpets, pillows, and low tables. Lanterns swung from hooks, gilding the warm night in hues of amber and gold. Musicians plucked at stringed instruments, and the scent of saffron and rosewater hung thick in the air. It was a scene of vivid splendor that might have made even the wealthiest Lannister banquet seem dour by comparison. There, under the swaying lanterns, the emissaries of each house broke bread together. Quentyn offered toasted almonds and pomegranates to the Tyrells. Arianne poured cups of sweet Dornish wine for the Baratheon delegates. Even Jaime Lannister, seated stiffly at a long table with a view of the sea, found himself nodding in conversation with Sir Bronn and a pair of Martell cousins. A soft breeze rolled off the water. For a moment, the illusions of courtesy held sway. Yet beneath the laughter and the clink of glasses, tension simmered. Every pair of eyes cast about for advantage. The Tyrells might quietly question if forming a permanent alliance with the Martells could help them reclaim their power in the Reach. The Lannisters might wonder what the cost of this peace would be. And the Targaryen contingent was especially watchful. Aegon gliding through the crowd, searching for any who might support his claim to the Iron Throne. None spoke openly of the throne, at least not yet. For the moment, Prince Doran wanted them to focus on the concept of a realm-wide truce. No more forced marches across the Crownlands. No more sacking of villages in the Riverlands. No more shifting alliances that left the small folk uncertain where their next meal would come from. The feudal system had splintered under the strain of so many wars. It was Doran's dream to see it mended, at least for a time. On the fourth evening, as the sun's dying rays bled across the horizon, Prince Doran summoned the principal lords and ladies to a private council in the Spear Tower, a tall, narrow structure that overlooked the entire city. Night spread across the desert like a cloak. Torches flickered in the tower's corridors, casting dancing shadows on the stone. Inside the council chamber, a circular table awaited the delegates, modest in size yet symbolic. Doran chose not to place himself at the head, for the table had no head. Instead, each lord or lady took a seat, forming a ring of equals. The oldest among them was Walder Frey's nephew, for the Lord of the Crossing had long since died, leaving the Freys in disarray. The proudest among them might have been Jaime Lannister, once the Kingsguard, now uncertain of his future in a realm that questioned Lannister supremacy. The most somber might have been a Stark bannerman, there in the name of Sansa Stark, Wardeness of the North, who had sent her delegate rather than come herself. Aegon Targaryen, in sable garments embroidered with the three-headed dragon, sat with a polite, inscrutable expression. Lords from the Vale, the Reach, even from the scattered Greyjoy fleets, had also sent ambassadors. One seat remained empty, that of the king on the Iron Throne, Tommen Baratheon. He was represented by Kevan Lannister's surviving son, Martin. The emptiness of that seat was a stark reminder that the realm's official ruler was absent. Doran began quietly, noting that though battles had ceased in many parts of Westeros, the realm was hardly at peace. Bandits roamed the Riverlands, the Ironborn chafed under new restrictions to their raiding, and the North was still licking its wounds after the Boltons' downfall. The Crown's coffers were, by all accounts, nearly empty. In such dire straits, what lord among them truly believed they could finance another war? He spoke of the advantage to each house if borders were open to trade, if roads were made safe once more, and if a new great council might be convened to settle disputes without bloodshed. Then he glanced around the table and asked with a voice as gentle as a father's to his children, who among them was truly willing to continue paying the butcher's bill in gold and in blood. The hush that followed was as deep as the desert night. Eventually, one by one they spoke. Not all were conciliatory. A bristling Tyrell voice reminded Doran of the broken vow that had once wed Elia Martell to Rhaegar Targaryen, implying the Tyrells had also sacrificed much under Targaryen rule, only to gain little. A Lannister retainer retorted that House Lannister had borne the brunt of the war's cost, maintaining the crown's authority and paying off debts. The discussion teetered toward arguments of right and might, but Doran let them air their grievances. This was precisely what needed to happen. The realm's old wounds had never healed because no one dared to gather and face them. Instead, they had resorted to swords too many times. Now, with swords laid aside, only words remained. For long hours, the council hammered at each other with those words. Yet Doran noticed a subtle shift. They had grown too tired for immediate war. And so, in that exhaustion, an opportunity arose. Tyrion Lannister, unexpectedly present under some promise of safe conduct, offered a plan to restore the crown's finances by opening trade routes through the southern seas, cooperating with the Dornish ports for shipments to the free cities. He glanced at Prince Doran, who nodded thoughtfully but betrayed no emotion. Representatives from the north murmured that if the goods and coin flowed, they might be persuaded to keep open the roads, so long as a portion of the revenue from trade might help rebuild the ravaged towns along the King's Road and in the Riverland. The veiled delegates, speaking on behalf of Lord Robert Arryn, demanded that such a plan include improved security along the mountain passes, for bandits had grown bold. And from there, the conversation branched out. An agreement might be drafted to allocate funds from the crown's new trade taxes to each region, proportionate to its needs, and the men it supplied for the realm's overall defense. At this, the proud lords sniffed at the notion of sharing men in a realm-wide defense. Yet the concept of a standing realm-wide force, funded by all, intrigued them. It might unify the Seven Kingdoms in a single protective measure, ensuring that no single region could so easily upset the balance with its private armies. Amid these swirling ideas, Prince Doran quietly recognized a chance to anchor a formal truce. He suggested a second Great Council, to be convened in King's Landing, though perhaps not in the Red Keep, a place many still associated with the worst excesses of the wars. Tyrion Lannister, ironically, proposed the Dragon Pit on Rhaenys Hill as a neutral site. The name Targaryen hung heavy in the air then. Aegon looked up, a subtle smirk on his lips, but said nothing. The seeds of a realm-wide agreement might be sown if each region pledged a certain number of observers, men or women of high birth or proven loyalty, to serve as an impartial advisory council, rotating leadership every year, so no single house dominated. Could it be done? More than a few cynics around that table believed it would collapse the moment they returned to their own lands. But Doran insisted on forging ahead, for if the lords left Sunspear with nothing to show for it, war would again beckon, and Westeros might not survive another. So the delegates haggled, raising voices, pounding fists on the table, until dawn's light crept through the high windows. By the time the sky paled, a rough framework had emerged, a realm-wide truce of 5 years, binding all present not to war against each other or to violate each other's borders. The king on the Iron Throne, still absent in body but present in name, would endorse it, for the Lannisters would see that Tommen had no better option if he wished to preserve what remained of his reign. The rebellious lords, among them the Ironborn, agreed only if they were guaranteed a path to legitimate trade and a voice in the next Great Council. Aegon Targaryen pressed for the recognition of his claim, a point that caused chaos and nearly scuttled the entire negotiation. Doran, with half-lidded eyes, brokered a compromise. The Great Council would determine the Targaryen claim in an open hearing, and all who had a stake in the question would be present to vote. Aegon eyed the assembled lords, uncertain if that might be a trap, but eventually agreed. The lure of a legitimate path to the throne was too tantalizing to ignore. At last, with the new sun shimmering upon the sea, the delegates parted. Some cursed under their breath, others walked away with a measure of hope. Doran remained in the tower, leaning on the windowsill, gazing out at the ships in the harbor and the golden dunes beyond. His heart pounded, for he knew the hardest work lay ahead. It was one thing to arrange words on parchment, it was another to make them live in men's hearts. He closed his eyes, thinking of Elia, of Oberyn, of all the Dornish who had died in distant wars. Perhaps at long last there was a different path. The next few weeks saw the most delicate dance of all, the forging of a formal treaty. By Doran's order, scribes and maesters worked day and night to craft the language. There would be no single overlord. The Iron Throne would remain the symbolic seat of power, with Tommen, and whoever might succeed him if the Great Council so decided, as the titular monarch. But a triannual convocation in King's Landing would allow the lords to discuss pressing matters, from taxes to the distribution of grain in times of famine. Each major region, North Vale, Riverlands, Iron Islands, Westerlands, Reach, Stormlands, Crownlands, and Dorne, would send 3 representatives. A code of neutrality was established. No region could muster an army larger than a pre-agreed limit without the council's approval. Of course, details about how to enforce such limits were murky, especially in far-flung locales. Yet, the principle was laid down, and enforcement might come through the combined threat of the other regions. If one house broke the treaty, it would face the wrath of all. That was the hope, at least. To ensure no immediate betrayal, the delegates agreed to arrange a web of hostages, though that word was never used in official documents. Instead, they were to be called wards, young nobles exchanged between houses, forging personal ties that might deter families from plunging the realm into chaos. A Stark ward would reside in Casterly Rock, a Lannister ward would dwell in Winterfell. A Tyrell ward might go to the Eyrie. A Dornish ward might stay in King's Landing. This was not a new concept. Such exchanges had existed for centuries, but now they would be formalized under the auspices of the realm-wide truce. The notion of sending beloved heirs into enemy territories unsettled many hearts, but Doran pointed out that, historically, wards had often become close friends of their host families, forming bonds that transcended old feuds. Caution reigned, but necessity spoke louder. The hardest part was the question of the Targaryen claim. Aegon insisted on a guarantee that he might press his right through a Great Council vote, while the Lannister faction insisted that Tommen's recognized status as the sitting king must not be undermined prematurely. Finally, they settled on a compromise. The Great Council, set for a date in the following year, would hear claims. Until then, no banners would be called to support or oppose the Targaryen bid. A strict neutrality was to be observed. Doran breathed easier when ink finally touched parchment, sealing the agreement. He wondered if, one day, history might record it as a cunning Martell trap, or as a genuine stroke of altruism. The truth, he suspected, might be somewhere in between. He wanted peace, yes, but he also wanted a measure of justice for Aelia's children. If Aegon was truly Rhaegar's son, then House Martell might yet see its line elevated. But in the short term, Doran's focus was unwavering. Secure the truce, give the realm time to heal. With the treaty drafted, each house affixed its seal. The Lannisters pressed a golden lion into hot wax. The Stark's direwolf mark looked almost ghostly, in gray wax. The Tully sigil splashed a trout, while the Arryn falcon soared on a field of pale blue. Dorne's golden sun was last, and Doran felt a shiver run through him as he pressed the heated seal against the parchment. It was done, or at least it had begun. In truth, the next days were fraught with anxious waiting. Would someone try to tear the treaty at once? Would a single rage-filled moment lead to a stabbing in the corridors, an accident that triggered all-out war? Yet, one by one, the delegations departed Sunspear without violence. Most carried copies of the truce, carefully guarded in chests or hidden among official documents. Many promised to send wards south at the appointed times, or to welcome wards north with begrudging courtesy. Letters would precede them, ensuring the host families knew exactly whom they were receiving. And thus, with the swirling dust of departing caravels and caravans, the great experiment began. The first few months were the most precarious. Ravaged by war, the Riverlands greeted the news of a realm-wide truce with cautious optimism. Jaime Lannister and Brienne of Tarth, who had found a curious alliance in recent times, traveled along the King's Road to see that the new laws were enforced, dealing sternly with any roving bandits. In one village near the Crossroads Inn, local peasants reported that marauders had seized the harvest. Jaime led a small retinue of Lannister men, and interestingly, a pair of Dornish volunteers left in the region after accompanying one of the wards, to drive them out. Having once been the figurehead of oppression, Jaime's presence defending the small folk caused quite a stir. But as word spread that the Lannisters were working with the Martells under the new truce, hope began to blossom. The cynics predicted it wouldn't last, but for the moment, it was a respite from chaos. In the north, the new wardness, Sansa Stark, found her position bolstered by the realm-wide peace. Supplies of grain and seeds, purchased from the Reach with carefully negotiated crown loans, began to flow into White Harbor, from where they could be distributed to winter-scorched villages. The arrangement called for fair pricing, and the central authority in King's Landing, bolstered by Tyrion Lannister's cunning with numbers, aimed to ensure no profiteering soared beyond reason. Of course, the North rarely trusted Southern promises. But when the first shipments arrived as scheduled, escorted by knights sworn to no single house but to the realm's new peace force, a meager group of volunteers from across the Seven Kingdoms, eyebrows lifted in cautious gratitude. Even harsh winter winds carried the rumor that, for once, the squabbling lords south of the Neck might actually be trying to help rather than exploit. The Vale, under Lord Robert Arryn's Regency Council, made its own moves. Petyr Baelish had retreated somewhat from the public eye, having lost many of his manipulative levers when forced to comply with the truce. He could no longer pit one house against another so easily. Instead, the Vale's farmland produced a comfortable surplus, which was sold at moderate prices to the crown in exchange for seats at the upcoming Great Council. Knights of the Vale patrolled the mountain passes, ensuring that travelers bearing the new realm's sanctioned documents of free passage could traverse in safety. Bandits realized quickly that any robbery of official caravans might bring down the wrath of multiple houses, not just the local one. While some still roamed in remote corners, most found it harder to operate. Even the Iron Islands, battered by repeated failures at rebellion, began a modest transformation. The young lord of the Iron Islands, one of Balon Greyjoy's grandsons, overshadowed by so many violent uncles, declared that since the truce guaranteed them certain trade benefits, there was at least coin to be made in cooperating. A cluster of ironborn ships began operating under letters of marque that allowed them to pursue piracy only beyond the realm's recognized routes. It was a compromise that rankled some of the ironborn who still yearned for the old way. Yet, the influx of legitimate silver from commerce and fisheries and shipping lanes built new harbors on Pike, salted with the hope that perhaps there was more to life than endless raids. King's Landing itself underwent a quiet shift. Tommen, still a young king, watched from the Red Keep as the city's new administration, guided largely by Kevan Lannister's partial regency and Tyrion's improbable return to influence, began to reorganize the crown's debts. The Iron Bank of Braavos, with which the crown had a treacherous history, softened its stance once it saw proof that the realm was consolidating. The crown began to repay interest on long overdue loans, financed partly by new taxes on trade flowing through the southern ports. Street crime in Flea Bottom remained a problem, but with the relief of war's burdens, more resources were available to maintain order. The Gold Cloaks found themselves supplemented by a handful of men from the realm's new peace force, though integration was fraught with rivalries and suspicion. Still, the King's Landing roads, for so long battered by war, began to see caravans again, ships disgorging goods from Dorne, the Reach, and even the North. The city grew vibrant with color and commerce. Grumbles persisted, of course. Peasants claimed the new taxes were too high, and some lamented the presence of foreigners in their city. But any such tension was a far cry from the chaos of the previous years. Meanwhile, House Martell watched all of this with cautious pride. Prince Doran's health worsened, his joints swelling with gout, his hands trembling from age and exertion. Yet with every letter that arrived from across the realm, describing how the truce held and commerce blossomed, the corners of his mouth curved in a gentle smile. Arianne traveled to King's Landing to see the new system in action, forging friendships, and perhaps more, among the ambassadors and wards gathered there. Quentin, for his part, took a small retinue north to treat with the Starks, forging an unlikely camaraderie with the new generation of wolves in Winterfell. He wrote back, describing the austere beauty of the snow-laden forests, the quiet resilience of the people there, and the tension that still lingered, waiting for some betrayal that might undo it all. But betrayal did not come, at least, not immediately. Of course, not all was tranquil. Rumors abounded that certain houses, resentful of Lannister or Targaryen claims, whispered of overthrowing the new council. Some in the Westerlands grumbled that paying reparations for the war was unjust. In the back alleys of Old Town, conspiracies gestated to undermine the Great Council. And in the cold corners of the north, talk of White Walkers and other terrors beyond the wall lingered in hushed tones, though many refused to believe such legends. Still, as the realm settled into a grudging peace, these troubles remained at the level of rumor, not open rebellion. Then came the day appointed for the Great Council. A full year had passed since the gathering in Sunspear, and the delegates converged on King's Landing once more. This time they arrived by land and sea with far less trepidation. The roads were safer, the taxes were regulated, and though tensions simmered, no major conflict had erupted. The Dragon Pit, situated on Rhaenys' Hill, had been partially restored for the occasion, though it could never again house living dragons. Its grand dome had been patched, and scaffolds ringed the interior. A wide circular floor had been cleared, lined with benches and canopied areas for the lords, ladies, and their attendants. Tommen Baratheon, flanked by the Kingsguard, featuring a reinvigorated Sir Balon Swan and others, sat on a raised platform reminiscent of the Iron Throne's dais. To his left stood the hand-picked members of the new advisory council, representing each region. To his right, seats for the major claimants to the throne or their spokespersons. Among them, Aegon Targaryen stood out, his black hair and regal posture reminiscent, some whispered, of Rhaegar's ghost. Trumpets blared. The great council was called to order. A hush fell across the Dragon Pit as lords, ladies, and smallfolk observers took in the spectacle. Tyrion Lannister, as Master of Coin, presented an accounting of the crown's finances. The realm was still deeply in debt, but progress had been made, and trade revenues had steadily grown. The Riverlands were rebuilding. The North was recovering. Dorne thrived under stable trade routes. Perhaps most significant, the realm had known a year without large-scale warfare, a rarity in recent memory. Applause broke out, cautious yet hopeful. Then came the matter that had threatened to overshadow all else, the Targaryen claim. Aegon rose, dressed in a plain black tunic, no crown on his brow. He stated his case simply. He was the son of Prince Rhaegar and Princess Elia Martell, long believed dead but in truth smuggled away to Essos, raised and protected by loyalists who believed in the Targaryen restoration. He did not condemn Tommen. Rather, he argued that the realm deserved a king with untainted blood. A stir moved through the audience, some outraged at the insinuation that Tommen's blood was tainted, others nodding in agreement. Aegon turned to Prince Doran, who was seated in a place of honor near the front, and acknowledged the pain House Martell had endured. He spoke with a glimmer of sincerity, or so it seemed. Whether or not all believed him, he carried himself with a princely bearing. His words hung in the air, an echo of centuries of Targaryen rule. In response, Sir Kevan Lannister, speaking on behalf of House Lannister and the king, insisted that Tommen was the lawful son of King Robert Baratheon and Queen Cersei. The realm recognized him. He had been crowned in the Great Sept Day. Aegon had no proof except the word of a few exiled lords and the rumor of his birth. Moreover, Tommen had presided over the forging of peace in the last year, something the realm desperately needed. It was not wise to upset the new stability with a radical shift in leadership. The debate raged. Lords rose to speak for or against the claim. The watchers in the Dragon Pit muttered among themselves, some recalling the Mad King's tyranny, others longing for the stability the Targaryens had once represented. Finally, the assembly put forth a motion to submit the Targaryen claim to a formal vote among the representatives of each great region, plus King's Landing and the Iron Islands. The wards were not permitted to vote, only the principal lords or their chosen delegates. By the tally, if a majority recognized Aegon's claim, he would be proclaimed heir apparent, while Tommen would remain king until Aegon's coronation. If the vote failed, Aegon would be compelled to renounce his claim, at least for the duration of the realm's new truce. The hush that descended was profound. This was precisely the step that many had feared, turning the question of kingship into a matter of shared governance. Over the course of 3 days, the delegates argued, conferred, and tried to sway others. Bribes changed hands. Promises of marriage alliances were whispered in corners. Prince Doran watched, letting events unfold. He had orchestrated the structure, but he would not force the result. If the realm was truly to find peace, it needed to decide for itself. Arianne did her part, speaking passionately to the Tyrells about the mutual benefit of forging a stronger alliance with Dorne, under a Targaryen whose mother was Elia Martell. The Lannisters, for their part, strove to rally the Westerlands, the Crownlands, and the Stormlands, pointing to Tommen's rightful place. The North was uncertain. The Vale wavered. The Riverlands, having seen the worst of the fighting, wanted only stability, caring less who wore the crown as long as the truce continued. The Iron Islands weighed which side might offer them more autonomy in the future. At last, the day of the vote arrived. The lords assembled once more in the dragon pit, tension coiled like a spring. One by one, the regions cast their votes. The Westerlands declared for Tommen as expected. The North's representative, after much soul-searching, voted for Aegon, citing the old ties between the Stark and Targaryen lines, Bran the Builder's history, among other myths, and a dissatisfaction with the Lannisters' past deeds in the North. The Stormlands, under the influence of a newly ascendant branch of House Baratheon, declared for Tommen, albeit grudgingly. The Vale shocked many by supporting Aegon, perhaps swayed by Arianna's negotiations, and by a promise that the Vale's independence would be more respected under a Targaryen. The Riverlands, battered by war, gave a split decision that ultimately tipped to neutrality. When pressed, they cast their vote for no one, stating they would abide by the council's final verdict. The Iron Islands cast a surprising vote for Tommen, apparently promised expanded trade privileges and minimal oversight of the Ironborn fleet. The Reach, still reeling from the losses in the War of the Five Kings, hesitated but eventually sided with Aegon, thanks to behind-the-scenes persuasion by the Martells and a suspicion that Tommen's rule was merely Lannister rule by another name. Finally, Dorne stepped forward, and Prince Doran's chosen delegate, Quentyn Martell, announced Dorne's support for Aegon. At the end of the tally, the vote stood precariously close. Some said a second round might be needed. But with the Riverlands abstaining, the final count edged in Aegon's favor by a single vote. The uproar that followed was immediate. A portion of the crowd cheered, those who yearned for a Targaryen restoration. Others shouted in anger, insisting it was a rigged vote or that the Riverlands' neutrality corrupted the result. King Tommen, pale-faced, looked to his advisors. Kevan Lannister stood with a grim expression, uncertain how to proceed. Yet the new laws stated the result was binding, provided the crown recognized the Great Council's authority, which it had, under the terms of the truce. Aegon stepped forward, bowing to Tommen, acknowledging him as the current king, and proposed a formal transition at some date the council would set. He did not wish to overthrow Tommen by violence. Rather, the realm would create a stable plan for transferring power so as not to disturb the peace. Tommen, though only a boy still, managed a dignified nod. The crowd erupted again in debate. But gradually, under the stern presence of the Peace Force guards and the watchful eyes of both Targaryen and Lannister loyalists, the tension calmed. In the days that followed, a complex arrangement took shape. The crown would remain on Tommen's head for 2 more years, during which a Regency Council, composed of representatives from each region, would help Tommen rule while a thorough inquiry into Aegon's claim was concluded. If, at the end of the 2 years, the council confirmed the claim's legitimacy, Aegon would be crowned in the Dragon Pit, with Tommen abdicating. If it found contrary evidence, or if Aegon was proven false, the realm would remain Tommen's. In either case, the realm-wide truce would endure. Punitive measures against any house that tried to break the arrangement would be swift and severe. A delicate compromise, precarious as a sword balanced on its tip. But for now, an uneasy acceptance settled in. Prince Doran, returning to Sunspear, felt a measure of relief. The Martells, by throwing their support behind Aegon, had taken a risk. Yet they had done so through the structure of the Great Council, not by raising spears or calling banners. That in itself was a triumph of the new system's potential. By the time he reached his solar in Sunspear, reading fresh reports of continued peace, a tear might have glistened in his eye. Doran believed, as he had for years, that vengeance might be replaced with a more subtle justice. Should Aegon ascend, it would in some small way avenge Elia Martell by restoring her line to the throne she was robbed of. Yet Doran also recognized the tenuousness of it all. Would the Lannisters truly lay down their power so meekly if the inquiry confirmed Aegon's bloodline? Would the wards, exchanged among the houses, form new bonds of friendship that kept the realm stable? Or would they simply become hostages in a future war? Seasons passed, and life in Westeros settled into a new pattern, not entirely free of intrigue and conflict, but notably absent of open war. Village fairs resumed in the Reach, harvest festivals in the north, and quieter nights in the Westerlands. The realm's new peace force, still small and imperfect, served as a symbol of the unity forged in the truce. Individual houses still maintained their personal guards and armies, but the memory of the War of the Five Kings and the new threat of collective retaliation restrained them from rash violence. The small folk at least found respite. Fields were planted, roads repaired, and trade caravans plied their routes. From the neck of the long-lost Targaryen goddess statue in Maidenpool to the dusty squares of Sunspear, talk of the new order spread with each traveler's tale. Some said it was the dawn of a golden age. Others predicted it was but a lull before an even greater storm. Yet for now, the peace held. At the one-year mark of the Great Council's resolution, a second session was convened in King's Landing to review progress. Aegon, restless, arrived once more. Tommen, growing taller, tried to demonstrate the maturity of a true king. The inquiry into Aegon's parentage had turned up ambiguous testimonies, some confirming the possibility, others casting doubt. Despite the tension, no swords were drawn. The wards exchanged among the houses spoke of their experiences. A Lannister youth spending a year in Winterfell marveled at the honorable ways of the Starks, while a Stark girl in Casterly Rock wrote letters praising the library and lamenting the dryness of the western climate. A Tyrell heir in the Eyrie discovered a taste for falconry. Subtle threads of connection wove themselves across the realm, forging personal ties that might outlast political convenience. Gradually, as each house discovered small benefits in the arrangement, outright hostility faded. Lords who had once sharpened their swords at the mention of old grudges found themselves preoccupied with building alliances in the new council. Vying for power took a different shape: words, negotiations, and influence at the council table rather than steel on the battlefield. More than once, petty disputes nearly escalated into violence, like when the Lord of the Dreadfort demanded compensation for perceived insults from the Serwins, or when a newly declared petty king on Skagos threatened to rebel. But each time, the combined authority of the realm's houses prevailed, at least enough to prevent war. A sense of wonder, or perhaps disbelief, spread among the small folk. They had never imagined so many proud houses would actually abide by a peace enforced by mutual agreement. And House Martell, the mediators of this grand experiment, found its influence quietly rising. Prince Doran's name was spoken with something akin to reverence in certain circles, though more cynically minded lords regarded him as a fox in the henhouse, a cunning old man who had used the realm's exhaustion to place House Martell at the center of power. Whatever the truth, Doran's health waned further, and in time Arianne Martell emerged as the leading voice for Dorne in King's Landing. She navigated the swirling politics with a mixture of flirtation and strategic insight, forging alliances with the Tyrells, smoothing tensions with the Lannisters, and maintaining a steady rapport with Aegon. In her own way, she continued Doran's legacy, ensuring that Dorne remained a linchpin in the new order. As the next year drew on, word came of stirrings beyond Westeros. A merchant vessel from Pentos carried rumors of a Dothraki Khalasar crossing the sea in search of new conquests, and of sellswords gathering in Volantis with an eye on Westeros' relative wealth. But the realm, no longer fractured, projected a unified front. Raven after raven soared east with messages from the Great Council, warning foreign powers that any invasion would be met with the combined might of the Seven Kingdoms, now bound by mutual defense pacts. Whether real or exaggerated, the message was enough to discourage opportunistic warlords. It was a testament to the new system's potential that no single kingdom was left to stand alone. 3 years after the initial signing of the Sunspear Accords, Westeros still had its internal frictions, but the once constant threat of war had eased. Towns rebuilt, farmland recovered, and new trade routes blossomed with the free cities. The inquiry into Aegon's claim remained inconclusive, but a new wave of witnesses from across the narrow sea was scheduled to appear. Some suspected the final hearing would confirm him. Others expected a quiet concession and a permanent arrangement to keep Tommen on the throne. Regardless, the realm seemed more concerned now with how to administer itself than with coronations. It was, in Doran's eyes, progress. Yet time, the ever-silent watchman, had its way with the Prince of Dorne. One balmy afternoon in Sunspear, as gulls cawed over the harbor, Doran Martell took to his bed, unable to rise. Maesters attended him, but the advanced state of his gout and other ailments gave no quarter. Ariane and Quentin knelt by his bedside, tears in their eyes. In a soft, rasping whisper, Doran asked them to continue what he had begun. He did not speak of vengeance or conquest. He spoke of seeing the children of Westeros grow up in a land not ravaged by ceaseless war, of small folk able to plant crops without fear, of city folk thriving under the steady hum of trade. Perhaps, he murmured, Oberyn's thirst for vengeance had been replaced by a thirst for something greater, a stable realm. Then, with a sigh that carried the weight of decades, Prince Doran Martell closed his eyes for the final time. In the days that followed, black banners hung from the walls of Sunspear. The water gardens echoed with mournful silence. Doran prepared to welcome a new prince or princess. Ariane, the eldest, stepped forward, crowned by Dornish tradition in a modest ceremony. Her first official act was to proclaim that House Martell remained steadfast in its commitment to the realm-wide truce. She dispatched letters to every corner of Westeros, reaffirming her father's vision. And the realm, moved by a mixture of respect and fear of returning to old ways, responded with condolences and tributes. A subtle reflection of how far Dorne's influence had spread through the new order. Some whispered that with Doran gone, there was nothing to keep old hatreds in check. Yet months passed and no mass outbreak of hostilities erupted. The Great Council convened again, deciding to postpone the final decision on Aegon's claim for another year. But in all other matters, they continued to govern by consensus and negotiation. When news of a poor harvest in the Reach reached King's Landing, the North and Riverlands offered grain shipments. In exchange, the Reach promised more men to patrol the roads. Small increments of trust gradually accumulated, weaving a net that grew stronger each season. Through it all, Ariane Martell traveled widely, taking her father's place as mediator. She went to Highgarden to honor the Tyrell's generosity in the final battles of the War of the Five Kings, reassuring them that Dorne wanted no rivalry with the Reach. She journeyed to the Eyrie, forging a pact of mutual defense with the Vale in the event of foreign invasion, a symbol of solidarity that would have been laughable only a few years prior. In King's Landing, she advised the boy King Tommen, now visibly older, on how to maintain the loyalty of his bannermen. She took care never to overstep her bounds. Meanwhile, Quentin resided part-time in the north, forging deeper friendships with the Starks, who now recognized that House Martell's leadership had spared the realm from further devastation. Slowly, the name Martell came to be spoken with a certain respect throughout Westeros, as the instigators of the most unexpected peace the realm had seen in centuries. Beneath the surface, of course, intrigue still roiled. Varys skulked in the shadows, weaving new webs of secrets. Petyr Baelish maintained a smaller but still potent network of informants. The Iron Bank of Braavos kept a keen eye on the Crown's repayment schedule, ever ready to exercise its leverage. And beyond the narrow sea, the future was uncertain. Word of Daenerys Targaryen's fate in Meereen, whether she yet lived or had vanished, sometimes reached Westeros in garbled fragments. Could she return one day with dragons reborn? Might that spark a new conflagration? No one knew. But for the moment, Prince Doran's peace overshadowed such distant speculation. Then in the 5th year of the truce, a momentous event took place. The crowning of Aegon Targaryen, recognized at last by a majority of the Great Council, after the final inquiry presented testimony from exiled Kingsguard, who claimed to have smuggled him out of King's Landing as an infant. Tommen, in a lavish but bittersweet ceremony, abdicated, stepping aside with surprising grace. He was given a keep in the Westerlands, a comfortable estate, and recognized as a lord of high station. The realm braced itself for chaos, for the Lannisters to lash out in fury, for some bloodshed to mark the sudden shift. But the truce had already woven its tendrils into every corner of Westeros. The Lannisters, mindful of the monstrous debts they still carried, understood that an open rebellion would bring ruin, especially with half the realm prepared to defend the new Targaryen king. And so, in a day that felt almost surreal, the crown changed hands peacefully. Aegon's coronation took place in the Dragon Pit, an echo of ancient Targaryen splendor died. He wore a black and red, a circlet of Valyrian steel set with rubies upon his brow. House Martell stood at his side, the memory of Elia present in every moment. Doran's sun and spear banner fluttered close to the revived dragon banner. Representatives from the North, Vale, Reach, Westerlands, Riverlands, Iron Islands, and Stormlands looked on, some with reverence, some with trepidation. But the significance was not lost on anyone. House Martell had mediated a realm-wide truce so powerful that even a change of dynasties occurred without war. The realm had shifted from the old model of might makes right to a precarious experiment in shared governance, and for the time being, it held. In the months following Aegon's coronation, the Great Council continued to meet regularly. King Aegon VI, as he was styled, traveled the realm, seeking to bind each region closer. He invested new lords, resolved border disputes through the council's mediation, and reduced taxes on war-torn provinces. He found that the peace Doran Martell had wrought was a foundation upon which a new Targaryen reign could stand without drowning in blood. This, in many ways, was Doran's lasting victory. By weaving together alliances, by fostering the notion that each house had a place at the table, by ensuring that no single power could seize control without consequence, he had forced Westeros into a state of unity it had seldom known. Years turned, and while not every day was free of conflict, the scale of those conflicts remained small. Skirmishes among petty lords were quickly resolved by the threat of combined arms from the rest of the kingdom. Trade continued to expand, bringing an age of relative prosperity. The Red Keep, once haunted by the echoes of tyranny and madness, now housed a more moderate court, overshadowed at times by the echo of Targaryen ambition, but tempered by a realm that refused to be dragged into another ruinous war. Tommen lived out his days in quiet comfort, occasionally visiting King's Landing as an honored guest. Aegon, for his part, surprised many by consulting not just with his council but often with the heads of the great houses themselves, fostering a sense of inclusion that kept conspiracies at bay. While the bards might have preferred a more dramatic tapestry of conquests and rebellion, the small folk began to whisper that these days of calm and rebuilding were a blessing they never thought possible. And House Martell? Over time it was recognized as the moral linchpin of the new era. Though Dorne had not been free of intrigue, it had given the realm the impetus to talk instead of stab. Arianne Martell, now the ruling princess of Dorne, reigned with a measured hand. She championed policies that furthered the exchange of wards and the development of joint trade routes. Her cousin Tyne Sand served as something of a roving emissary, weaving her own brand of persuasion across the courts of Westeros. Quentyn, more reserved, managed Dorne's internal affairs, ensuring that the desert province's proud traditions were preserved, even as it integrated more deeply into a unified realm. The Martells never forgot the memory of Elia and Oberyn, but they also refused to let that memory fuel perpetual war. Instead, they let it guide them toward a vision of justice that did not require endless bloodshed. Decades later, when maesters set quill to parchment to chronicle the events that shaped the modern era of Westeros, they would note that House Martell's mediation in Sunspear was the hinge upon which history turned. They might debate Doran's motives. Was he truly altruistic or cunningly ambitious? But they could not deny the outcome. The War of the Five Kings, Robert's rebellion before it, the devastations that followed, all had led to near collapse. Yet from the scorching deserts of Dorne had come a measured voice, urging a realm-wide truce, forging a framework in which the houses could coexist, if only out of mutual necessity. And once the wounds of war began to heal, a surprising sense of unity emerged, strong enough to weather the transition from Baratheon Lannister rule to a reborn Targaryen monarchy. In village squares, traveling singers composed ballads about the lasting peace of the Spear and Sun, praising the unlikely alliance of former enemies. Some lords found these songs tedious, longing in secret for the old days of unchallenged feudal might. But the small folk, who had seen their homes burned and their families scattered, often wept at the memory of the old violence, grateful that the peace, however tenuous, had endured. Parents no longer feared their sons would be conscripted for some distant lord's ambition. Harvests piled up in granaries instead of being seized by marching armies. The realm's roads, once lined with corpses, now bustled with merchants and travelers seeking opportunity. There were, of course, new challenges. The complexities of administering shared governance across regions that had once feuded for centuries proved immense. The Great Council bickered over taxes, trade tariffs, and the policing of borders. Now and then, old rivalries flared dangerously. But with each passing year, the tapestry of intermarriages, ward exchanges, and mutual economic reliance made large-scale war a more remote possibility. Could it truly last for generations? That was uncertain. The appetites for power and ambition might one day tear apart what Doran Martell had so carefully stitched. Yet as long as the memory of the war's devastation lingered, and the new institutions held firm, the realm marched toward a more peaceful destiny. If ever an epitaph was offered for Prince Doran Martell, it would be that he used neither sword nor threat of dragons to bring the realm to heel, but only patience and quiet resolve. While others had rushed headlong into battles, trusting in steel and cunning, he had spun webs of alliance that eventually ensnared all. By inviting every house to Sunspear, by forcing them to disarm at the gates, he had set a precedent. Westeros could be governed by reason as well as by fear. The realm might not have recognized it at the time, but in those sweltering halls of Sunspear, a new chapter had begun. And so across the Seven Kingdoms, from the icy snows of the Wall to the sun-scorched dunes of Dorne, men and women spoke in awed tones of the Martell-brokered truce that had quieted a century's worth of grievances, at least for a while. The shimmer of banners in the wind no longer signaled war but a gathering of the council, a promise of words over swords. The small folk harvested their fields without dread. Mothers did not cry out at every rumor of a levy, and knights wore their armor in ceremonial jousts more often than in full-scale battles. The storms of the past might still brood on the horizon, but for now at least, the sun shone brightly upon Westeros, casting a warm glow over a kingdom unaccustomed to such lasting peace. And in that warmth, from the proud spires of Sunspear to the colossal shadow of the Red Keep, hope, like a desert flower, found a way to bloom. The seasons turned gently through the Seven Kingdoms, and in the dusty archives of the Citadel, maesters began calling this uneasy era the Martell Peace. Still, few in Westeros expected the arrangement to endure forever. The memory of so much bloodshed lingered beneath the realm's new prosperity, and the great lords were no strangers to ambition or distrust. Yet the promise of shared governance, hammered out in Sunspear and later refined in King's Landing, had put down roots deeper than most realized. When the realm changed kings, placing Aegon Targaryen on the Iron Throne after Tommen Baratheon abdicated, no storm of swords followed. Banners were not called, armies not assembled. Instead, the Great Council handled the matter as a grave but orderly affair. So, the wheels of peace continued to turn, even as the world beyond Westeros shifted in ways that might someday challenge the realm's fragile accord. Dorne, meanwhile, weathered the quiet sorrow of losing Prince Doran, its architect of diplomacy. Arianne Martell's ascendance as Princess of Dorne saw her balancing two impulses, preserving her father's vision of a stable realm and seeking new ways to fortify Dornish interests in this evolving order. From the Water Gardens to the farthest desert keeps, whispers circulated about the possibility of Dorne achieving greater influence than it ever had under the Iron Throne. Yet with that influence came responsibilities. The realm watched Dorne now, to see how it would honor the treaties for which Prince Doran had labored so long. A misstep could unravel the entire tapestry. Arianne was keenly aware of that, and so her rule began under the banner of carefully measured steps, seeking alliances, drafting letters to every corner of Westeros, and welcoming wards from the Reach, the Riverlands, and beyond with grace and courtesy. On a day like any other, a small caravan arrived at Sunspear's gates, a handful of wooden wagons bearing the sigil of House Tyrell, accompanied by a modest guard. Their arrival was not meant for grand ceremony, for they came unarmed in accordance with the laws set down at the start of the Martell Peace. Among them was a young Tyrell scion, distant kin to Margaery and Loras, sent south to live as a ward under House Martell for 3 years. The lad, perhaps 13, with large brown eyes and a look of perpetual wonder, was escorted into the old palace. Arianne greeted him warmly, thanked his guardians for delivering him safely, and promised to see that he was educated well in Dornish customs and the shared laws that now bound the realm. A few older Dornish ladies, who remembered the bitterness between the Reach and Dorne in past centuries, shook their heads in quiet astonishment at how times had changed. In the weeks following this ward's arrival, more wards from other regions made their way into Dorne. Some were younger sons or daughters, their noble families seeing strategic advantage in forging ties to the Desert Kingdom. Others were truly hostages, though never publicly referred to as such, intended to safeguard the peace by ensuring that their kin would think twice before raising swords against the realm's agreements. Ariane ensured they were treated well, offering them comfortable quarters, tutors who taught history, languages, and even the dances of the Dornish courts. Initially, some wards resisted the heat and the foreign customs, complaining of scorpions and hot sands, but soon they came to appreciate the region's hospitality. They tasted sweet Dornish peppers, lounged in the cool serenity of the water gardens, and found themselves unexpectedly charmed by the nightly music that echoed through Sunspear's winding corridors. All this, of course, was part of a broader plan. The wards would grow up with friendships across houses, diminishing the old barriers between families and territories. It was a page from Doran's book, scaled up to an entire realm. And it worked. Letters flew back to Highgarden, to Riverrun, to the Eyrie, praising the Martell's graciousness. While older lords might still nurse grudges, the younger generation, raised among enemies who were no longer enemies, had difficulty viewing each other as rivals fated to clash on the battlefield. A Summer Islander who worked as a minstrel in the palace once commented that he'd never seen such a tapestry of new kinship being woven. And so, if bitterness remained in the older hearts, at least it had less chance of infecting the future. Yet, no peace exists without challenges. As the realm settled into this new normal, murmurs rose from certain corners about the White Walkers and Whites, those half-legendary monsters from the far north. Few believed the tales, but enough rumors drifted down the King's Road to unsettle folk. Some said a new Night's Watch crow had brought dire warnings that the dead stirred near the wall. Others scoffed, dismissing these as the tall tales of wildlings. Aegon Targaryen's court in King's Landing convened a small council to investigate, sending a pair of emissaries to Castle Black. The Great Council itself, while focused on trade, law, and the enforcement of mutual defense pacts, decided it would allocate a small portion of resources to the Night's Watch, just in case. Gold and supplies were shipped north, but there was little sense of urgency among the southern lords. Winter, however, was drawing nearer with every passing month. Ravens brought word of unseasonal chills around the neck, of thinning game in the Wolfswood, and of storms lashing the coasts. As the nights grew longer, the solemn words of the Night's Watch began to resonate more strongly. "We are the Watchers on the Wall!" Some younger members of the Great Council proposed a formal expedition to the Wall, a mix of knights and scholars, to see for themselves if any threat brewed. But many older lords balked, remembering the realm's exhaustion from war, the expense of raising large forces, and the quiet cynicism that the White Walkers might be nothing more than ancient fables. Ultimately, a compromise was reached. A small volunteer contingent, funded collectively, would join the Watch for a season, led by a knight from each region. The Watchers from the north supported the idea wholeheartedly. If it calmed fears and prevented potential crisis, so much the better. Meanwhile, in the Iron Islands, the new peace had begun to reshape a culture long defined by reaving and raiding. The younger lords, seeing profit in the realm's extended trade routes, built bigger docks for legitimate commerce. Merchant vessels sailed from Pike to Lannisport or Old Town, carrying salted fish, iron ore, and rare items gleaned from the seas. The old guard, though, groused that this drifted far from the old way. A handful of holdfasts still swore that the Ironborn would never truly bend to any unified realm, especially not one orchestrated by Dornish cunning. Here and there, seeds of rebellion threatened to sprout. Secret gatherings in hidden coves, muttered vows to one day break the Martell peace. But the presence of wards from the Iron Islands and other strongholds, and wards from the mainland housed among the Ironborn, meant any such rebellion could cost the Ironborn dearly. A wily old sea captain named Harlan Pike was overheard telling an Ironborn youth, "Give it a few decades, lad. They'll forget to watch us, and then we'll sail as we please." But for now, at least, the anchors of peace held. The capital, King's Landing, bustled with more energy than it had known in decades. Once battered by siege and overshadowed by a failing monarchy, it now enjoyed the fruit of stable trade and the king's open-door policy. Though King Aegon VI presided from the Red Keep, he frequently walked among the people in the city's winding streets, escorted by a small retinue of the new peace force who'd sworn to defend the realm rather than any one house. Fishmongers hawked their wares at the waterfront. Urchins scampered in alleyways with less fear of being impressed into some mercenary's service. And the gold cloaks, better funded than before, worked to maintain order. Flea Bottom, though hardly a paradise, at least had fewer corpses left in its alleys each morning. Taverns, brothels, and inns saw a steady influx of travelers, from Pentoshi traders to Northmen on diplomatic errands. And at the heart of the city, the restored Dragon Pit, still a shadow of its former glory, now hosted the Great Council's gatherings. The structure had been reinforced, its dome patched, and a series of smaller meeting chambers carved from its lower levels. There, delegates from every corner of the realm convened to discuss matters of law, trade, and mutual defense, forging a new sense of identity as Westerosi first and Bannerman second. It was in one of these smaller meeting rooms that a particularly delicate matter arose, the question of appointing a Master of Whispers. Ever since the days of Varys, the realm had recognized the value of a spy master, though the concept unsettled many lords. Who would hold such a position now, in a realm meant to be governed by trust and open negotiation? And yet, the tasks of intelligence, monitoring potential foreign threats, preventing conspiracies from within, remained vital. King Aegon understood too well that ignoring these matters would leave the realm blind to danger. Some lords proposed a rotating spy master, someone who changed every year so no single region could dominate the flow of secrets. Others suggested dividing the responsibility among multiple sworn watchers from each region. The debates went on for days. Ultimately, they decided to create a Whispering Council, a small group of carefully vetted individuals from different houses and regions, each sworn to share findings in common. If any single member tried to hoard information, the rest would censure them. It was a compromise typical of the new order, cumbersome and prone to squabbling, yet designed to check abuses of power. While these developments unfolded in King's Landing, Princess Arianne found herself venturing northward for the first time in her life. Quentin, who had spent extensive time with the Starks, had advised her to see their domain firsthand. Letters were one thing, but personal presence was another. So she gathered a small retinue, including a few of the Sand Snakes, Tiny, Sorella, and Illyria's youngest daughter, Laraza, and set out from Dorne. The journey took them across the Reach, where they were welcomed by Lord Tarly, serving as a deputy to the Tyrells in the region. Even that reception was civil enough. Tarly was known for his gruff manner and formidable discipline, yet under the Martell peace, he presented no hostility. He provided an escort of knights to see the Dornish travelers safely to the Roserod. After passing the Mander and crossing into the Crownlands, Arianne marveled at how many caravans passed unmolested. Much of the old fear of bandits had dissipated. Indeed, now even small companies of merchants traveled with minimal guards, trusting in the realm's new laws, and the threat that any local lord ignoring them would face widespread condemnation. Weeks later, Arianne reached the Neck, where a sweltering dampness replaced the dryness of Dorne. She felt a sense of awe stepping onto the causeway that led to Moat Cailin, the ancient fortress battered by centuries of war. The watchman there saluted politely, and let her retinue pass, evidence that the realm's unity was not merely paper-thin. The north spread out before her like a land from a different world, vast pine forests, rolling hills, and crisp winds that carried an undercurrent of pine and loam. They encountered the last remnants of autumn's color in the leaves, glowing red and gold along the King's Road. Occasionally, children in the villages gathered to watch them pass, curious about the fabled Dornish princess. Some called out respectful greetings. Others simply gawked at the sight of southerners with their bright silks and burnouses. When at last they arrived at Winterfell, Arianne could hardly contain her curiosity. She found the seat of House Stark busy with trade wagons and visitors. The old gray walls, once battered by wars, stood rebuilt under the direction of Sansa Stark, who had come into her own as Lady of Winterfell. Smoke curled from many chimneys, and the hot spring's warmth kept the courtyard surprisingly temperate. Arianne was received in the Great Hall, where Sansa and her brother, young Rickon Stark, now a tall and broad-shouldered youth, greeted the Dornish delegation with quiet but genuine courtesy. The Northerners might remain reserved, but they were not unfriendly. Over hot spiced wine, they exchanged formalities, recalling how House Martell and House Stark had once eyed each other from opposite ends of the realm, but now found themselves working side by side in the Great Council. Sansa thanked Arianne for ensuring that vital supplies had reached the north during the last harsh winter, referencing the cooperative grain shipments orchestrated through King's Landing. During the days that followed, Arianne walked the battlements, speaking with northern knights and stewards about life under the new peace. Some confessed they had been wary. After all, the Starks had lost much, from Ned Stark's execution to Robb Stark's betrayal at the Red Wedding. They feared that any promise of unity could be just another Southern ploy. But over the last few years, as trade routes stabilized and no armies marched north, that fear had mellowed. Now the biggest concern was rumors from beyond the wall. Even if the White Walkers were legends, wildling raiders had increased in number. The Free Folk, as they called themselves, were in flux. Some joined with the Night's Watch, others slipped farther into the frozen wastes, and here and there, tales of whites persisted. Arianne listened thoughtfully, remembering that much of Dorne's diplomacy had focused on keeping the Southern lords from turning on each other. She realized she knew far too little about the dangers that lurked in the northern expanse. While in Winterfell, Arianne also forged personal ties. She visited with Mira Reed and her kin from the Crannogmen, who had also come to treat with the Starks. She found Mira as lithe and spirited as a spearwife, skilled with her net and frog spear, but possessing a gentle wisdom about the old gods of the net. Tiny Sand was particularly intrigued by the stories of the children of the forest and the hidden groves in the swamps. Each evening, the Dornish delegation gathered in Winterfell's Great Hall for a feast that was simpler than Dornish fare but hearty: roasted game, dark bread, and strong ale. The Northerners were no strangers to hospitality, and though they might not dance late into the night like in Dorne, they gathered by the fire to swap stories. On one such evening, Rickon Stark recounted his strange childhood wandering, from fleeing Winterfell to captivity under House Umber, and eventually finding refuge again under his sister's rule. He spoke of direwolves prowling the forest edges, of how the old magic of the north never truly vanished. Arianne, more used to heated deserts and sun-scorched canyons, felt a thrilling chill at these tales of living myths. As the feasts continued, quiet conversations about the future of the realm emerged. Sansa Stark admitted that the North's loyalty to the Targaryen throne still felt tenuous. They had never forgotten the injustice done to their father by the Mad King, or the horrors inflicted on House Stark during the War of the Five Kings. Yet Sansa also recognized that the new order, with its councils and treaties, had spared her people further devastation. She asked Arianne candidly, "Can this truly last, or will it all collapse the moment a lesser king takes the throne?" Arianne's reply, measured and honest, acknowledged the fragility of the Martell peace. She spoke of her father's dream that by weaving so many alliances, by binding the houses through wards and trade and law, they might build a structure that could endure the absence of any single strong ruler. "Whether that is a dream or reality," Arianne said, "I cannot yet say. But as long as good people keep choosing words over swords, it has a chance." Before leaving Winterfell, Arianne expressed a desire to see the wall for herself, to speak with the Night's Watch, and confirm these rumors of threats in the far north. Sansa arranged for a small escort to accompany her. It was an unusual request for a southern princess, but the North had come to trust Arianne's sincerity. Thus, 2 weeks later, Arianne, along with Tiny Sand, a handful of Dornish guards, and a few northern guides, found themselves riding north through the Wolfswood, the air growing colder each day. They passed scattered villages, some half empty, their inhabitants having moved south after a series of harsh winters, others still clinging to the old ways of hunting and trapping in the deep woods. Arianne felt a strange exhilaration. This was as far from the warm sands of Dorne as one could imagine. When they reached Castle Black, the looming presence of the wall took her breath away. An immense sheet of ice, shimmering faintly in what sunlight filtered through gray clouds, stretching beyond sight in both directions. The Night's Watch met them at the gate, black-clad sentinels who seemed half-ghost in the swirling snow. The acting Lord Commander, an older man with a graying beard named Mallister, received Arianne with courtesy, but also with an underlying sense of desperation. The Watch had seen better days. Despite the realm's new cooperation, the North's population was not large, and not many volunteers came to join a life of hardship at the wall. The Crown's funding had helped with supplies, but every winter brought new challenges. Wildlings continued to test the frontier, and there were darker rumors, occasional sightings of strange figures in the night, with eyes like blue stars. Still, none had yet come close enough to confirm or deny their existence conclusively. Arianne asked for a tour. They took her up the wooden elevator, creaking and swaying high atop the wall. There, she witnessed the endless expanse of white land to the north, a wilderness so vast and desolate it seemed almost another world. Snow-laden forests, frozen rivers, distant peaks. The wind whipped at her hair, biting her cheeks. Tyene, standing beside her, shivered despite her fur cloak. The Lord Commander pointed to the horizon and said quietly, "Beyond that is the domain of old nightmares and new. We do what we can here, but the 7 kingdoms barely remember us. Even with the realm at peace, the Watch stands alone." Ariane felt a wave of compassion and a certain dread. She resolved to carry this message back to King's Landing. Whatever might lurk beyond the wall, the Watch needed more resources, more men, if they were to remain the shield that guarded the realms of men. Their journey south was a somber one, with each day shorter than the last, the winter sun rising late and setting early. Ariane could not shake the sense that something loomed just outside the realm's awareness. War among the great houses had ended, but the world was wider than the petty quarrels of lords. As soon as she returned to Winterfell, she penned letters describing the Watch's plight, sending ravens not just to King Aegon but to the great council members. By the time she departed the north entirely, heading back to Dorne, the cold had settled into her bones, though she also carried a renewed determination to see the realm stand united against any threat, be it from within or without. Her letters did stir discussion in King's Landing. Some lords, particularly those from the north and the Vale, supported reinforcing the Watch, sending more supplies, encouraging younger sons to join. Others scoffed at sending precious resources to the edge of the world made little sense when many southern roads still needed repair. Yet the memory of the old wars was still fresh enough that no one wanted to appear as the obstructor of unity. So, grudgingly, the Great Council agreed to allocate an increased stipend to the Night's Watch for the coming winter, in exchange for regular reports from the Lord Commander on wildling movements and any trace of these rumored others. Ariane, having returned to Sunspear, felt only partially satisfied. It was something, but not enough to soothe the disquiet in her mind. Time flowed on. The wards continued their exchanges, and new generations grew up more accustomed to the Martell peace than the older lords who had fought in the War of the 5 Kings. A Tarly squire in Sunspear made friends with a Martell cousin, discovering they both adored hawking. A young Karstark lady studied with the maesters in Old Town alongside a girl from House Connington, forging a bond that disregarded old enmities. Interregional tournaments began popping up, smaller in scale than the massive showy jousts of old, but meant to foster friendly rivalry among knights. These tournaments, though not free from the occasional scandal or outburst, generally ended peacefully, with shared feasts afterward. The realm's economy thrived enough that many small folk found themselves with better lives than they could recall. Beggars still walked the streets, of course, but fewer than in the aftermath of war. Meanwhile, King Aegon VI settled into his reign. Having ascended the throne without sparking bloodshed, he strove to prove himself a just and proactive ruler. He traveled widely, visiting the Westerlands to quell restive Lannister bannermen, who still harbored resentment, journeying to the Stormlands to affirm Baratheon loyalty, and spending time in the Reach to solidify ties with House Tyrell. Everywhere he went, he was flanked by a retinue of realm-sworn knights, men from diverse houses who had pledged themselves to upholding the Martell peace. This varied guard was a tangible display of how the realm's loyalties were no longer singular, but interwoven. Aegon discovered that he enjoyed traveling, meeting the people who made up his kingdom. He listened to petitions personally, dispensed gold for rebuilding projects, and used the specter of the Great Council's collective power to remind the local lords that the old ways of tyranny or feudal opportunism would not stand. Occasionally, a would-be rebel or an outspoken malcontent caused trouble, but these incidents never escalated far. The synergy of multiple great houses working together was too overwhelming a force to defy easily. Beneath this outward harmony, the Targaryen king did face one source of tension, the lingering question of Danarian. Rumors persisted of a silver-haired queen across the Narrow Sea, once known to command dragons, though news of her had grown murky after the Battle of Meereen and the sudden disappearance of Drogon. Some said she had perished in the Red Waste, others that she had sailed west with a small band of followers. The maesters in King's Landing considered her a vanished curiosity. But King Aegon wondered, if Daenerys yet lived, might she challenge him? Would the realm's tenuous peace be tested anew if a rival Targaryen with living dragons appeared on Westerosi shores? In private, Aegon shared these fears with a few trusted advisors, including Tyrion Lannister, who had once crossed paths with Daenerys in Essos, and a representative of House Martell. They concluded that if Daenerys returned, the best course would be to welcome her if she came in peace, or unify the realm against her if she came in war. Ironically, the Martell peace had made Westeros more capable of facing an external threat than it had been in centuries. Seasons cycled. Across the sea, the free cities grappled with their own upheavals, but the trade routes to Westeros grew stronger, bringing in coin and foreign luxuries that enriched lords and merchants alike. The Iron Bank of Braavos, ever watchful, found King Aegon's administration to be far more reliable in repaying debts than the Lannisters had been on their own, or the Baratheons before them. With the realm's finances managed by a small council of experts, Tyrion Lannister among them, loans were refinanced and interest paid steadily. Braavos was content, the realm was content. Or so it seemed. At the cusp of another winter, a strange event occurred in the Vale. The young Lord Robert Arryn, whose health had always been fragile, died unexpectedly of a seizure. In older times, the death of a lord might have caused an immediate scramble for power, with potential regents or guardians fighting for control of the region. Instead, under the Martell peace, the Vale's leading families convened an emergency council and swiftly declared a successor, Lord Elis Waynwood, who had a distant claim through a maternal line. The Great Council in King's Landing formally recognized Lord Elis, ensuring a smooth transition. It was a testament to how the realm's new processes could prevent civil conflict. Those who might have challenged Waynwood's ascent found it wiser to comply lest they face the entire kingdom's wrath. Elsewhere, though, not all transitions were so smooth. In the Westerlands, an aging Jaime Lannister grew weary of court life and retreated to Casterly Rock. King Aegon had asked him to remain in King's Landing as a symbol of Lannister loyalty, but Jaime, carrying the weight of too many sorrows and regrets, preferred solitude. Without him in the capital, the Lannister presence waned. Certain lesser Lannister branches maneuvered to increase their power, feeling that a diminished presence might free them from old obligations. Yet the realm's watchful eyes were everywhere. Even the slightest hint of a rebellious muster would have triggered an immediate response. So the Westerlands too remained in line, albeit with an undercurrent of dissatisfaction. Word leaked out that Cersei Lannister, once the feared Queen Regent, was a recluse in some high tower, driven half mad by her losses. The region's younger knights, hungry for glory, found the new peace an endless frustration. Where could they prove themselves if the realm never warred? Such restlessness among young warriors was not unique to the Westerlands. In Dorne, too, certain hot-blooded knights lamented the lack of real battles in which to test their skill. The Sand Snakes, the daughters of Oberyn Martell, were among the few who had found outlets for their aggression, some serving as roving emissaries, others traveling with caravans to demonstrate Dornish prowess. Still, when men and women grow up on stories of knightly valor or Dornish feats of arms, endless peace can feel almost stifling. Tournaments provided some satisfaction, but the adrenaline rush of real conflict was missing. A wise old knight in Starfall sighed and said, "Be grateful for your dull days. I've seen too many friends buried." Yet the young rarely heed such advice. And so the Martell peace endured another year, and then another. The wards from each region reached adulthood, forging cross-regional friendships that baffled their elders. More joint building projects were proposed, bridges over the Trident, new roads in the Vale, expansions to the shipyards at Old Town and Pike. The Great Council hammered out details for each, ensuring mutual benefit and shared cost. In time, the concept of a shared realm began to take root in a new generation. If old grudges lingered, they found fewer reasons to flare into open conflict. Hardships remained, famine in certain corners, occasional banditry, the perennial threat of storms and disease. But these were addressed by an increasingly cohesive network of maesters, local lords, and crown officials. The greatest test, however, was not to come from within. It began quietly in the Far East, where caravels from Volantis brought whispers of a fresh Dothraki movement under a fearsome Khal. There had been many calls over the years, but this one reportedly commanded an enormous khalasar that threatened the free cities on a scale unseen since the doom of Valyria. As trade vessels arrived in Westeros with news of sacked villages along the southern coasts of Essos, the merchants and bankers worried about the disruption of commerce. A few asked, would the Dothraki eventually look to cross the narrow sea? In the past, the warring lords of Westeros might have shrugged, confident that no horse lord could safely ferry enough warriors across the sea. But with the realm's new unity, the possibility that the Dothraki might try seemed too dangerous to ignore. King Aegon convened an emergency session of the Great Council to discuss the rumors. Could the Dothraki truly muster ships, or ally with one of the free cities, to invade Westeros? Opinions diverged wildly. The Ironborn boasted that their fleets would repel any attempt. The lords of the Narrow Sea, especially House Valerion, insisted that a large enough force could still land if given safe harbor somewhere along the coast. Old alliances with the free cities came under review. Braavos, Pentos, and Lys each had their own agendas, and might or might not cooperate in halting a Dothraki advance. Some lords felt that Westeros should remain passive unless threatened directly. Others, including Arianne Martell, suggested offering naval support to the eastern cities to stop the threat before it grew. But the Great Council had never faced a looming foreign invasion of this scale. The entire notion was disconcerting. While this debate raged, ravens arrived from the north bearing more urgent tidings. The Night's Watch reported a surge of wildlings fleeing south, claiming something far worse than bandits haunted the icy wastes. The few watchers who ventured beyond the wall swore they saw whites, walking corpses in the forests. One patrol disappeared entirely. The Lord Commander's letter ended with a stark warning. Winter is no longer coming, it has come. Panicked rumors spread through Winterfell and beyond. If the old legends were true, if the others walked again, then the realm faced a threat not from the east, but from the north. At first, many southern lords insisted it was madness, or a ploy by the Night's Watch to gain more support. But the gloom on Sansa Stark's face when she addressed the Great Council lent weight to the reports. She would not lie about something so grave. Thus, the Great Council found itself torn between two possible dangers, the Dothraki in the east and the others in the far north. Resources were finite. The realm's strength had grown under the Martell peace, but it was not infinite. Armies would have to be raised if these threats proved real. Warships, fortifications, supply lines, these did not appear overnight. The notion of a large realm-wide mobilization terrified some lords, who remembered too keenly how quickly everything could unravel once men marched. Debates soared in the Dragon Pit, voices echoing against the vaulted dome. The Watchers from Dorne cautioned that if any region withheld its share, old suspicions would flare. A Stark envoy insisted that the threat from the north was immediate and existential, far greater than any horse lords across the sea. The Iron Islands championed the threat in the east, for they could see themselves losing maritime trade if the Dothraki ravaged the coastal cities. King Aegon strove to keep the council from fragmenting, urging them to weigh the danger carefully and respond as one. In a stroke of compromise, the council devised a two-pronged approach. A partial levy of troops and a formidable fleet would be prepared in the east, in coordination with Braavos and Pentos, to deter any Dothraki incursion. Simultaneously, a more substantial force would reinforce the north, establishing forward posts south of the wall, ready to respond if the Whites or others actually advanced. This would be done under the auspices of the new realm-wide system. Each major region contributed men and supplies in proportion to its population and wealth. The wards exchanged among the houses, now grown to young adulthood, often stepped forward, urging their families to cooperate. They had learned that conflict within the realm weakened everyone. Reluctantly, the lords agreed. Old grudges seemed small in the face of these new threats. It was the largest coordinated military effort Westeros had undertaken in memory, yet it was forged not out of ambition, but out of fear that the entire land might be imperiled. Preparations swept the land. Blacksmiths in the Westerlands forged swords and axes, as well as heavy chain links for the ships. The Reach, with its abundant fields, harvested and stored great quantities of grain to feed armies. The Vale offered cavalry, its knights renowned for discipline on the field. The Stormlands prepared siege engineers and ballistae, thinking ahead to any scenario where they might face monstrous enemies. Dorne contributed gold, soldiers, and the famed Dornish sand steeds for scouting. The North, resolute, readied its warriors. House banners that had once been overshadowed by war began to gather under Winterfell's call. Meanwhile, the Crown, centered in King's Landing, organized logistics, rationing out coin from the royal treasury, and coordinating shipments with newly formed committees of lords and merchants. It was a massive undertaking, and yet it lacked the chaos that might have reigned in previous generations. The structure of the Martell peace, its councils, its checks and balances, had prepared Westeros for collective action. King Aegon named a pair of supreme commanders to lead these forces, one in the east, for the fleet and the coast, and one in the north, for the land defense. For the Eastern Command he selected Sir Davos Seaworth, who had quietly risen to high respect for his honesty and deep ties with the northern coasts of the Narrow Sea. Though once a smuggler, Davos had proven himself a man of unwavering integrity, and no house felt threatened by his appointment. For the Northern Command, the choice was more contentious. Some urged that a Stark lead. Others insisted the realm needed a famed knight from the south to prove their commitment. In the end, Aegon settled on a compromise. Jon Connington's son, Rolly Connington, would serve as co-commander alongside Rickon Stark. Connington had loyal ties to House Targaryen, while Rickon was the heir to Winterfell and intimately familiar with the terrain. The two men, younger than many of the lords, had been wards in each other's lands during the early years of the Martell peace. They were friends, rumor said, which further allayed concerns of rivalry. So the stage was set for a coordinated response unlike anything Westeros had seen in 1,000 years, if indeed the threat at the wall or across the sea proved dire. Throughout these preparations, Princess Arianne observed events from Sunspear and King's Landing. She traveled back and forth, meeting with the Great Council, ensuring Dorne's obligations were met, but also urging caution against mobilizing too hastily. She was haunted by the thought that if the realm turned its entire attention outward, an opportunistic faction might spark a civil war. Yet she also knew that to do nothing, to ignore the looming threats, would be unthinkable. She wrote frequent letters to Quentyn, who was once more in Winterfell, helping organize the new forces. His replies were sparse but filled with a sense of urgency. We must not wait. The wildlings speak of frozen dead. Some nights our men hear strange howls in the forest. If they are mere tales, better we be prepared than caught unawares. At last, the newly raised forces took shape. In the north, thousands of men mustered under Rickon Stark and Rolly Connington's banner, a dire wolf combined with the flaming heart of House Connington. Smaller contingents from the Vale, the Riverlands, and even a token force from the Westerlands arrived by boat at White Harbor or marched along the King's Road. They established encampments south of the Wall, near the Giftlands, fortifying old keeps that had lain abandoned for decades. Rangers from the Night's Watch led scouting missions into the haunted forest. Reports trickled back of wildlings fleeing in droves, confirming that something was indeed pushing them south. But sightings of actual whites or others remained rare and unconfirmed. Flickers of movement in the icy darkness, rumored blue eyes glimpsed at a distance. Simultaneously, in the east, Sir Davos led a growing fleet that patrolled between the Vale and Dragonstone, with outposts at Gulltown and Maidenpool. They maintained vigilant watch for any sign of a large invasion fleet from the Free Cities or beyond. Diplomats from Braavos and Pentos visited the Great Council frequently, assuring Westeros that the Dothraki threat had been blunted for the moment. Some said that Khalasar had turned its attention elsewhere, deeper into Essos. Still, the realm kept its guard up, unwilling to dismiss the possibility that the Horse Lords might test Westeros eventually. Months passed in a tense stalemate. The armies in the north became restless. Supplies had to be replenished, and the soldiers had little to do but train and patrol in the bitter cold. Whispered complaints arose. Was the realm spending vast resources on a phantom menace? Did the Martell peace demand indefinite vigilance against every rumor of doom? Rickon Stark, a young man but with a wolfish demeanor, insisted that winter was the season of patience, that no one ought to assume safety when the nights grew so long. Meanwhile, Rolly Connington found himself mediating between fiery knights from the south who chafed at the cold and skeptical northerners who saw them as outsiders. Thankfully, the seeds of friendship sown by the wards helped ease tensions. Many southern soldiers found common ground with the local folk, learning northern songs and customs. The famed stew from the winter town, thick with root vegetables, became a favorite among the men from the Reach, who joked that it was better than anything served in Old Town's taverns. Bonds of camaraderie began to form, bridging what might have been a deep cultural divide. The watchmen along the wall remained ever vigilant. Maesters stationed in Castle Black recorded daily weather patterns, confirming that temperatures were dropping lower than any winter in recent memory. Ravens from east watched by the sea, and the Shadow Tower described massive ice floes creeping down the coasts. One night, the aurora danced in the sky, painting the darkness with green and purple lights. The wildlings spoke of it as an omen. But the months rolled on without a large-scale attack. A few rangers vanished in the forest. No one knew if they had died at wildling hands, succumbed to the cold, or stumbled upon something worse. Murmurs of dissatisfaction circulated among southern lords who had contributed money and troops, complaining that the entire fiasco might be a hoax. But Sansa Stark from Winterfell quietly reminded them, "Better a false alarm than thousands of innocent folk left defenseless if the legends are real." Farther south, the realm did not grind to a halt just because armies had gathered up north. The Martell Peace's institutions hummed along, ensuring that roads stayed relatively safe, that trade continued, that the wards were properly cared for. Young marriages were arranged between houses that only a decade earlier would have been sworn enemies, consolidating the new alliances. Tournaments still occurred, albeit less frequently, to keep morale high. King Aegon found himself torn between spending time in King's Landing, where the daily governance of the realm needed attention, and traveling north to inspect the camps near the wall. If he was to be a king of the entire realm, he had to show concern for every corner. Ultimately, he decided to winter in the north, a bold step that signaled his dedication to the Watch on the Wall. The Red Keep was left under the stewardship of a council led by Tyrion Lannister and Arianne Martell, who would remain in the capital to oversee daily affairs. Aegon's arrival in Winterfell, with a royal entourage that included several great lords, was a momentous occasion for the north. No Targaryen king had visited since the days of Aegon the Conqueror, according to the old histories. The last Targaryen presence of note had been the ill-fated betrothal of Rhaelle Targaryen to a Baratheon, or so some genealogists insisted. The modern North saw this as a sign of respect, proof that the Martell Peace had indeed lifted barriers once thought unbreakable. The great courtyard of Winterfell blazed with torches as Aegon dismounted. Snow swirled around him, but he cut a regal figure in a thick black fur cloak, a circlet of Valyrian steel on his brow. Rickon Stark knelt and offered his fealty, though they were more allies than subject and liege in practice. Wolfhounds barked, and the flicker of light danced on old stone walls. A hush fell as king and warden greeted each other in the swirling cold. For a few days feasts filled the hall, venison, roast boar, mead, and warm spiced wine. Aegon took Sansa Stark's arm, dancing in a measured swirl of northern pipes. Southern knights drank themselves merry with northern ale, boasting about their readiness to fight if the others dared to appear. Yet beneath the revelry lay an undercurrent of apprehension. Winterfell's hot springs could not keep out the knowledge that, out there, the wind blew harsh and unrelenting. At night, the direwolves howled in the godswood, their voices echoing through the halls. Sansa confided in Aegon that she remembered, from her girlhood, the stories old Nan had told, stories that spoke of white shadows and the long night. She hoped those stories were no more than that. When the feasting ended, Aegon and his retinue made the trek to the wall. The sight of the colossal ice structure awed the king as it had awed Arianne before him. Lord Commander Mallister received the royal party in the courtyard of Castle Black, the black-clad rangers forming lines to honor them. Aegon's presence did much to bolster the Night's Watch. They had never felt so recognized or supported by a king in living memory. Aegon toured the ramparts, stared out into the endless white beyond, and listened gravely to the testimonies of wildling refugees. One woman claimed to have seen her own mother rise from the grave with eyes of blue ice. Another told of entire villages swallowed by silent, creeping horror in the night. Some watchers thought these tales exaggerated, but the trembling in the refugees' voices was real enough. Faced with these accounts, Aegon ordered that patrols be doubled, that more supplies be brought from the storerooms to feed the wildlings who had surrendered to the Watch rather than starve. The wildlings, under a tenuous amnesty, were resettled in scattered camps south of the wall. The arrangement was chaotic, but better than leaving them to die or, worse, join the ranks of the undead if the rumors were true. Rickon Stark stepped in to organize the distribution of farmland in the gift, ensuring that the new arrivals had a chance to build a life. Tension arose with local northern peasants who feared the wildlings, but Rickon's presence, and the knowledge that the king himself sanctioned it, prevented most violence. Southern knights expecting a grand war found themselves handling logistical tasks, building shelters, clearing roads, and escorting supply wagons. Some grumbled that this was no glorious campaign, but others realized it was precisely the sort of quiet effort needed to defend the realm in winter. As the longest night of the year approached, the temperature plummeted. Snowdrifts built against the wall, and scouts returned with tales of deeper blizzards further north. Still, no organized army of the dead emerged from the darkness. No legion of others attacked. Anxiety mounted. Then, on a stormy night, a lone horn blast echoed from the top of the wall, once for rangers returning. The gates opened to reveal a handful of half-dead men stumbling inside, frost clinging to their beards, eyes wide with terror. Their leader collapsed into a drift, stammering about a skirmish in the forest. They had encountered walking corpses, only a handful, but enough to tear apart half their patrol. In the swirl of the storm, they barely escaped. Lord Commander Malister ushered them into the warmth, summoning the maesters. The battered survivors insisted they had heard eerie laughter in the wind and glimpsed pale figures moving among the trees. The news spread through the castle like wildfire. A small band of whites so close to the wall confirmed the old stories might be true. King Aegon, refusing to discount the warning, called an immediate council with Rickon Stark, Rolly Connington, the Night's Watch officers, and the Southern Knights. They decided to dispatch a stronger party, 200 men, well-armed, with fire-hardened weapons and dragon-glass arrowheads. The old lore suggested that obsidian could slay the others. The party would push north past the forest's edge in search of any sign of the undead. Aegon himself wished to go, but was talked out of it by Rickon and the Lord Commander, who argued that the realm could ill afford to lose its king if the worst occurred. Instead, Rolly Connington led the column, accompanied by an experienced ranger named Hullen and a handful of knights from various houses. They departed at dawn, forging into a wind so cold it burned the skin. Snow swirled in drifts that reached men's thighs. Each soldier wore multiple layers of fur. Banners were left behind. Stealth and speed were more important than pageantry in the wilderness. For days, they trudged onward, finding signs of scattered wildling camps long abandoned, bones half buried in snow, and twisted trees groaning under icy loads. The watchers kept an eye out for movement, but the forest seemed still, as if holding its breath. Only on the fourth day did something stir. One of the forward scouts returned at a run, breath steaming. He'd found tracks, barefoot, in the snow, many footprints moving in unison, headed east. Rolly Connington gathered the party, hearts pounding. If those tracks belonged to whites or others, then this was proof beyond rumor. They followed the tracks at a cautious distance, a hush falling over them as though the very air were listening. Twilight settled in, the day's light retreating behind gray clouds. Torches flickered in the gloom. Suddenly a shout went up from a flank patrol. Figures emerged from behind a stand of pine, stumbling, half-rotted shapes with blank blue eyes. A volley of arrows soared, many tipped with dragonglass, striking home. Some of the undead fell, but more stumbled forward, arms outstretched, jaws slack. The soldiers advanced in a tight formation, steel glinting under the torchlight. Fear clawed at them. The dead shouldn't walk, but the training and discipline demanded by the Martell peace had forged these men into a unified force. They stood fast as the whites collided with their shield wall. Cold chaos ensued. Swords hacked into rotting flesh. Frost-bitten fingers raked at steel and fur. Men screamed in revulsion as limbs kept moving even after being severed. Rolly Connington, in the thick of it, called for fire. Torches were thrust forward, igniting dead flesh which hissed and crackled. The stench was overwhelming. A white lunged at Rolly, its face half-eaten by decay, and he rammed a torch into its mouth. With a shriek, the body collapsed, thrashing. The men pressed on, driving the whites back. Then, through the swirl of snow, an even paler figure emerged. Tall, silent, with eyes like starlight on a frozen lake. Another, if the tales were true. Its armor looked like translucent ice, reflecting torchlight in ghostly colors. With a languid motion, it raised a long, thin blade of crystal that shimmered with deadly cold. A hush fell as men and whites alike paused. Connington stepped forward, brandishing a steel sword. The other moved with inhuman grace, dancing aside. Steel shattered on contact with the ice blade, shards falling like broken glass. Another knight rushed in, only to be felled by a single stroke that left him gasping with frost forming on his lips. Panic threatened to seize the men. But from the rear rank a ranger let fly an obsidian-tipped arrow. It streaked through the gloom and struck the other in the shoulder. The creature recoiled, letting out a soundless snarl. Cracked lines spread across its ice flesh, and with a strange high-pitched noise like breaking glass, it disintegrated into a fine mist of ice crystals. The wights around it collapsed inert, as though an unseen puppeteer had cut their strings. Silence descended, broken only by the ragged breathing of the men and the moan of the wind. They stared at the empty patch of ground where the other had stood. Many eyes flicked to the fallen wights that now lay still. No one spoke for a time, as if words might shatter the moment's fragile reality. Then Raleigh Connington exhaled a shaky breath. "We have our answer," he murmured. The others were real. The dead could walk. And obsidian was indeed a weapon against them. Stunned and battered, the column gathered its wounded and retreated, unwilling to push farther into the night. They had seen enough. When they returned to the wall, bearing a few corpses of wights as grim proof, a wave of shock swept Castle Black. Lord Commander Mallister immediately penned ravens to every corner of Westeros, including King's Landing, Winterfell, and Sunspear. King Aegon and Rickon Stark convened an urgent war council. Though the skirmish had involved only a few dozen wights, the presence of another was undeniable. The Age of Legends had returned, and if the others were stirring, Westeros faced a threat beyond comprehension. Knowledge from the distant past suggested that only dragonglass and Valyrian steel could harm them, and that fire could stop their corpses. But how many others might there be? If a mere handful marched south, the damage could be contained. If an entire army lurked in the frozen wastes, the ramifications were enormous. The northern forces, which had been restless and uncertain, now had terrifying clarity. Their foe was real, not a rumor. The Great Council, upon receiving the Raven, exploded in debate. Some demanded that every available soldier from the south march north immediately. Others worried that emptying the southern lands of men would leave them vulnerable to the Dothraki or any internal rebellion. A few lords went pale at the thought of facing ancient ice demons. Arianne Martell, still in King's Landing, stood up before them and argued passionately, "Our petty fears do not matter. Our realm faces a horror we barely understand. If the Martell peace means anything, it means we stand as one in the face of doom." Her words carried great weight, recalling her father Doran's vision of a united Westeros. Even the most reluctant lords felt their hearts stir. The realm had forged alliances to stop men from killing each other. Surely it could muster the will to stand against the cold hand of death itself. So the order went out. Westeros would rally its greatest defense in the north. King Aegon remained at the wall, planning strategy. The southern lords mustered more armies, stripping many castles of their able-bodied fighters, but leaving behind small garrisons to prevent chaos. The crown poured its treasury into forging and acquiring obsidian weapons. Dragonglass mined from Dragonstone's volcanic depths, and from certain hidden veins in the far west. Blacksmiths tried to rework Valyrian steel swords into smaller blades, though the rarity of Valyrian steel made that a poor solution for the masses. The maesters scoured ancient scrolls for any lore about the Long Night and the original war against the others. Priests of the Red Temple from Essos, hearing rumors of ice demons, traveled west offering their fiery faith as a weapon against the darkness. Westeros had never witnessed such a mobilization in living memory, yet the Martell Peace's infrastructure allowed it to happen with minimal internal strife. The wards, those living embodiments of inner-house unity, proved instrumental in coordinating efforts, sending ravens, negotiating supply routes, rallying morale. Winter deepened. Snow blanketed the riverlands, froze the roads of the Westerlands, and battered the coasts of the Stormlands. Even in Dorne, where snow rarely fell, the nights turned biting cold. The realm braced for the worst. Refugees from the far north, wildlings, free folk, outcasts, were permitted south under certain conditions. Castles in the Gift became overburdened, but no one dared turn them away for fear they might join the undead if left to die. Makeshift shelters sprang up. Disease threatened. But a cadre of maesters and healers worked tirelessly to keep plague at bay. The sense of looming battle weighed on every heart. War horns echoed across the plains outside Winterfell, where fresh levies assembled. Torches and braziers lit up the roads that led to the wall, a constant chain of supply wagons trudging onward. Day by day, more knights, archers, and spearmen arrived, huddling in the harsh camps with thick cloaks. Dorne's southern lancers looked especially miserable in the cold, but they endured, driven by duty and the knowledge that if the others triumphed, nowhere in Westeros would remain safe. At Castle Black, King Aegon established a command center in the old library tower, repurposed with maps and notes pinned to the walls. The leaders debated how best to fight an enemy that thrived in cold and darkness, that could potentially raise the fallen to fight again. Some advocated meeting them in open battle if they came south of the wall. Others insisted the wall itself was the best defense, provided the Watch could hold it. But the Watchers also remembered the rumor that the others could bring endless winter with them, that they could freeze entire seas. If they found a way around the wall, perhaps at Eastwatch on the coast, or by crossing a frozen sea to the west, Westeros would need a fallback plan. So, multiple lines of defense were prepared. Rickon Stark oversaw the fortification of Winterfell as a second stronghold. The Vale contributed engineers to strengthen Moat Cailin. If the others somehow broke through, the realm would force them to fight for every mile. In these dire times, some found a renewed sense of faith or destiny. The Red Priests spoke of Azor Ahai Reborn, the champion of light. They muttered that King Aegon might be that champion, or perhaps someone else would arise. Northerners turned to the old gods, praying in the heart trees for deliverance. Septs across the realm held vigils, calling on the Seven for protection. The cultural differences that once divided the realm now blended in a collective wave of hope and desperation. The Martell peace had taught Westeros how to negotiate and how to share. Now, faced with a threat beyond politics, the realm found itself forging a deeper unity. Word came from the east that the Dothraki had indeed turned away from a direct confrontation with Westeros after facing stiff resistance from Braavos and Pentos, aided by the royal fleet. The fear of invasion from that quarter receded. All eyes now turned to the north. The Great Council, practically relocated to Winterfell and Castle Black, stood on perpetual standby. Lords who had never ventured beyond the neck huddled in furs, discussing strategy over steaming bowls of stew. Soldiers constructed massive pyres of firewood and barrels of pitch, preparing to unleash flames if the dead arrived. Dragonglass arrowheads were fitted in workshops day and night. The dark jokes making the rounds suggested that no one would ever want to see a shard of black rock again after all this was done. Then, at long last, scouts returned from beyond the wall with a dreaded report. Movement in the far distance, thousands of shapes. The others were coming. They marched slowly, methodically, as though winter itself were their ally, forging a path of ice and death. The wildlings who had refused to flee were either dead or joined to the ranks of the Whites. Panic coursed through the fortress. Yet, beneath the fear, a grim readiness also took hold. They had prepared for this. They were as united as any realm could be. The horn sounded 3 times, once for rangers, twice for wildlings, thrice for others. The men on the wall felt their hearts pound. Torches glowed in the freezing blackness. King Aegon stood on the battlements, wind whipping at his cloak, as he peered into the darkness. Snow flurries drifted, obscuring vision. The distant silhouettes of the undead army flickered whenever moonlight pierced the clouds. Thousands, perhaps tens of thousands. The Watchers could almost feel the chill intensify, as though the others brought an unnatural cold with them. Some swore they saw pale riders on dead horses among the ranks. A horn blast shattered the tense silence. Arrows soared from the parapets, trailing fire or tipped with dragonglass. The front ranks of Whites staggered under the barrage, but more pressed forward. On the wall, men lowered barrels of pitch, setting them aflame and pouring them onto the gathered dead below. The night lit up in a hellish glow. Screams and hisses tore through the air. A wave of Whites surged at the gate, clawing at the ice, heedless of the flames. Through it all, pale shapes, others, moved with preternatural grace, shattering steel weapons, raising frost-laden swords that seemed to drain warmth from the air itself. Below, Raleigh Connington commanded ground forces who had been stationed in the rebuilt keeps. They formed ranks behind makeshift palisades. Flames leapt from trenches filled with tar. The Whites, unstoppable in their mindless hunger, stumbled into the fire. Others flickered at the edges, sowing confusion. Men died, only to be raised minutes later if their bodies were not burned. It was a horror beyond any mortal battle Westeros had known. Yet the defenders did not break. They held the line, rotating fresh squads forward, using signals to direct arrow volleys. Rickon Stark, leading a mounted reserve, charged into clusters of whites that threatened to flank the position. Fire-wreathed torches flared in the dark, dancing with steel. Swords of Valyrian steel clashed with ice blades, producing a ghastly shriek. Here and there, another shattered when struck by an obsidian spear, its shards dissolving into swirling snow. Atop the wall, King Aegon directed the archers, the pitch, the catapults that hurled fiery loads beyond the ramparts. The cold stung his face, but adrenaline and resolve kept him standing. If they failed here, all of Westeros would be lost. Horn blasts, shouts, and the keening wind blended into an unearthly symphony. The night dragged on, and still the undead kept coming, wave after wave. Climbing spikes of ice formed on the lower parts of the wall, as if the others could will the cold to shape a path upward. The Watchers destroyed those formations with fire each time they appeared. Below, the ground was a churning mass of snow, mud, corpses, and flame. Men cried out for the Seven, for the old gods, for a lore. Others died in stoic silence, or were torn apart by the undead. But still, the living fought. The Martell peace had taught them unity. Now, in a swirling maelstrom of ice and fire, that unity was tested to its limit. At a crucial moment, a section of the undead horde managed to breach a palisade near the western flank. Dozens of whites swarmed through, threatening to roll up the living lines. Raleigh Connington rallied his men, but the tide was overwhelming. Then, a sudden roar erupted. A small band of Dornish spearmen, led by none other than Tyne Sand, who had arrived with the southern reinforcements, charged in with torches and dragon glass-bladed spears. Their assault was wild, desperate. Tyne, though more famed for her subtlety and poisons, fought with a fury reminiscent of Oberyn Martell. The whites faltered as flame met them head-on, giving the rest of the defenders time to regroup. In that swirling melee, the legacy of House Martell clashed against the embodiment of winter's death. Eventually, the gap was sealed, the whites burned. But Tyene fell to her knees, an ice shard lodged in her side, her breaths ragged. Later, she would be carried from the field, her life saved by maesters, but only barely, a scar of frost left on her body. As the night wore on, the living managed to hold the line, though casualties were grievous. The others, for all their uncanny power, seemed to realize that the realm had come prepared with obsidian and flame. Dawn's first pale light found the undead army retreating back into the swirling snow, dragging their silent victims. The Watchers on the wall could scarcely believe it, but the assault subsided. Charred remains littered the killing field. Thousands of whites had been destroyed, though many more still lurked beyond sight. Of the living, hundreds lay dead, but they had not broken. They had stood together as one. King Aegon's cloak was singed, his face smeared with soot and half-frozen sweat. Rickon Stark limped from a wound that cut through layers of fur. The survivors stared at each other in exhausted relief, uncertain whether they had won or merely survived the first wave. In the days that followed, the battered defenders regrouped. The northern armies, now certain of the threat, redoubled their efforts. Reinforcements arrived from the south. Word spread quickly through ravens. The others had returned, and Westeros had endured its first battle with the dead in thousands of years. Bards would later call it the Battle of the Frozen Night. Priests of Erlorlor claimed that the living's unity and fire had repelled the darkness. In truth, it was a combination of unwavering courage, well-coordinated tactics, and the critical advantage of obsidian. The Martell peace had given Westeros the framework to muster those resources and fight side by side. Gone were the days when one region's crisis was another's opportunity. Now, the realm recognized that if the wall fell, all would fall. Despite the successful defense, no one believed the threat was over. The others were immortal, patient. They might wait for a deeper cold, or gather a larger horde of the dead. But Westeros had proven it would not collapse into civil war at the first strain. The realm's laws, alliances, and wards had forged a new identity. Knights from the Reach pitched tents beside spearmen from Dorne. Ironborn archers fought under the same banner as men from the Stormlands. Aegon Targaryen, with a crown of steel and ice-caked hair, addressed the survivors, thanking them for their valor, urging them to hold faith. If the night grew darker, they would face it together. And in that battered encampment, men who once might have slaughtered each other in wars for the throne found themselves clasping hands in weary camaraderie, united by something far greater than personal ambition. In King's Landing, Princess Ariane received the news of the battle's outcome with tears of relief. Tiny San still lived if barely, and the living had not been overrun. She sent more gold, more supplies north, ensuring that every blacksmith in Dorne worked tirelessly on obsidian spearheads. She also conferred with Tyrion Lannister to keep the realm stable in the south, so that no petty lord seized on the crisis to break the peace. By now, the idea of fracturing the realm during such a perilous time seemed unthinkable to most, but caution was prudent. She wrote a moving letter to the Great Council, reminding them that Prince Doran's dream had come to fruition in an unimaginable way, the entire realm standing shoulder to shoulder, not for conquest or power, but for survival. And so the story continued. The wall stood, manned by an unprecedented coalition of men from all corners of the Seven Kingdoms, guided by the Night's Watch. The winter deepened, harsh and unrelenting. Countless lesser clashes erupted as the Whites probed for weaknesses. Yet each time, the defenders rallied. News of these battles spread throughout the land, binding hearts in a shared cause. In taverns from Lannisport to Sunspear, folk spoke of the others, their shimmering ice blades, the horror of the undead. Yet they also spoke of heroic stands and improbable friendships across houses, once sworn to each other's ruin. The darkness of the long night threatened, but the flame of unity still burned. From across the narrow sea, a few ships arrived carrying strangers, refugees from Essos who fled wars or sought a new life in Westeros. Some were priests of Orlor, convinced that the true battle against darkness was now in Westeros. Others were merchants, hoping for profit despite the winter. Whispered rumors also spoke of a silver-haired woman traveling incognito, but no one could confirm if it was Daenerys Targaryen. The realm was too consumed by the northern front to pay heed to such whispers for the moment. Yet one evening, as King Aegon strategized with his commanders in the old library tower at Castle Black, a raven arrived bearing a peculiar message. It was sealed with an unfamiliar sigil, a dragon's head with a flame in its mouth. The contents suggested that the writer had discovered a new source of dragonglass, and possibly a hidden weapon that could greatly aid the fight. It invited the king to send an emissary to the island of Dragonstone with all haste. Puzzled, Aegon shared it with Rickon Stark and Lord Commander Mallister. They decided to dispatch a small group to investigate. With the others at the doorstep, any edge could prove decisive. Thus, from the flames and ice, from the forging of peace into a weapon against a common doom, the next chapter unfurled. The Martell peace had saved Westeros from self-destruction, only to unite it in a battle against an enemy older than memory. In doing so, it became something far greater than a mere treaty among lords. It became the realm's shield against the long night, a testament to Prince Doran Martell's patient vision, to the wards raised in each other's lands, to the Great Council that learned how to compromise rather than conquer. Though the outcome of the war against the others remained uncertain, one truth burned as bright as any beacon in the dark: Westeros stood as one. And in that unity, perhaps for the first time in its history, it had a chance to endure even the coldest winds of death. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The deep heart of winter lay over the land, a cloak of ice and shadow. Battles and skirmishes continued near the wall, each testing the defenders' resolve. Occasionally a line would falter, a keep would be overrun, and the living would be forced to burn their dead to prevent the others from adding to their ranks. Yet thanks to obsidian, fire, Valyrian steel, and discipline, the undead found no easy victory. New songs arose among the soldiers, songs that wove together the heraldries of many houses, praising the combined might of Lannister archers and Stark spears, Martell swords and Tyrell cavalry, Baratheon siege engines and Greyjoy scouts. The small folk clung to these songs as a sign that the living world remained bound by hope. In time, the pitched assaults became less frequent, the others retreating farther north as if waiting for a deeper cold, or seeking a new strategy. The watchers on the wall saw fewer whites shambling beneath them. Some men grew complacent, thinking perhaps they had broken the enemy's power. But wise commanders like Rickon Stark and Rolly Connington cautioned that the others had merely tested their defenses. The true storm might yet come. And so the realm stayed vigilant, forging on in the cold months, maintaining supply lines, rotating troops to avoid exhaustion. Whenever morale dipped, the memory of that first night's battle kindled a fierce determination. They would not let the dead claim the living. Far to the south, life carried on as best it could under the chill. The Great Council, partially relocated back to King's Landing, continued to oversee the kingdom's internal governance. Princess Ariane balanced her duties between the capital and Sunspear, ensuring Dorne's ports remained open for shipping vital grain and tools northward. The wards and young lords who had never known the old feuds took pride in the knowledge that they were part of a realm-wide effort. In the taverns of Flea Bottom, storytellers spun tales of heroic knights at the wall. For once, the poor men and women of the city felt no fear of an imminent war among their own lords. They faced an external threat, but at least their homes were not the battlefield. Beggars sometimes muttered that if the others ever broke through, all of Westeros would burn or freeze anyway, but for now the city did not starve. Breadlines formed but were kept orderly by the Crown's new distribution policies. Folk endured. At last, one day, a raven arrived in King's Landing bearing news that the Watchers on the Wall had long anticipated. The snows in the far north had ceased swirling beyond the horizon, and scouts reported an unimaginable host gathering for a final push. The others had massed more whites than ever, presumably having scoured the wastes for every dead thing they could animate. At their center, pale riders glimmered like ghosts. The scouts spoke of a monstrous shape among them, possibly an undead giant or something even stranger. King Aegon, still at Castle Black, summoned every man who could bear arms. The Great Council declared a final muster, calling all the soldiers that could be spared from the south to the north. No corner of the realm was left out. By the terms of the truce and the threat to all life, each house had to send its best. It would be the largest single gathering of armed men in Westeros since Aegon the Conqueror's landing, perhaps larger. Thus began the Great Northern March. Columns of troops, knights, and peasants armed with spears set off from the Westerlands, the Reach, the Vale, the Stormlands, the Riverlands, and even the Iron Islands, where newly constructed galleys carried men to White Harbor. Dorne, too, dispatched another wave of lancers and swordsmen, their bright banners a vivid clash against the snow. The journey was brutal. Many froze on the roads, for winter showed no mercy. But they came on, driven by the knowledge that this was do or die. They arrived in stages at Winterfell or smaller forts along the way, then proceeded north to the camps near the wall. Countless camps emerged, their fires dotting the snowy fields like stars. Some men fell ill, others lost limbs to frostbite. Maesters struggled to keep up with the injuries. And still, more arrived. The entire realm had emptied its coffers and poured out its strength, forging a single army from the Seven Kingdoms. In those camps, men from rival houses drank together, swapped stories, or huddled in fear of the final battle. The wards, now lords in their own right in some cases, took charge of small units composed of knights from multiple regions, forging a sense of unity in each banner group. Tying Sand, partially recovered, supervised the distribution of Dornish supplies. Jaime Lannister, old but still formidable, emerged from Casterly Rock to lend counsel, though his once golden hair had turned silver. The Vale Knights under Lord Elis Waynwood boasted about their prowess on steep terrain, while the River Lords jested that no one would find them, fish out of water in the snow. Tensions sometimes flared in the overcrowded camps, but each time, the thought of what lurked beyond the wall cooled tempers. King Aegon stood among them not in a plush tent but in simple quarters, determined to endure the same hardships as his men. Rickon Stark, newly come into the fullness of his role as Warden of the North, stood by the king's side. When word reached them that the others advanced, a hush spread across the miles of campfires. Trumpets sounded, horns blared, and men roused themselves in the pre-dawn cold. Commanders reviewed the plan. The bulk of the force would hold a defensive line south of the wall, while specially trained units armed with dragonglass and Valyrian steel sought out the others. The Watchers on the Wall would rain fire and pitch if the undead tried to breach the gate or climb. Reserves would be held near the flanks, including cavalry from the Vale and the Reach, to envelop any whites that broke through. It was a massive operation, depending on discipline and unity at every level. Any mistake could lead to utter collapse. The realm's hope hung on men who, a generation earlier, might have been bitter enemies. Then, In the pale gray light, the dead came. At first they were scarcely visible, dark shapes in the snow. But soon the entire horizon seemed to shift with their approach. Tens of thousands of wights trudged forward in silence, a silent avalanche of corpses. Wildlings, free folk, old knights, watchmen, animals, anything that had died in the far north. Here and there, enormous silhouettes loomed, undead giants, slouching forward with horrifying strength. At the center, the others rode pale horses, their armor gleaming with an otherworldly sheen. A chill wind preceded them, as if the air itself obeyed their command. The living host drew in a collective breath. Many swallowed their terror, gripping weapons. Priests of the Red God lit torches and brandished them high, chanting in a half-dozen languages. Archers knocked obsidian-tipped arrows. Drums rolled. For a moment the world held still. Two forces at the edge of existence, life and death poised to clash. A roar from the living line signaled the start. A barrage of flaming arrows arced through the sky, streaking toward the undead ranks. At the same moment the others raised their swords, and an unnatural wind battered the men, extinguishing some flames mid-arc. Still, enough arrows found their mark to bring down rows of wights. Fire blossomed among the walking corpses, who tumbled and screeched in silent agony. The lines of the undead staggered, then pressed on, unstoppable despite the losses. The living advanced to meet them, a thunderous collision of steel and rotting flesh. The air filled with the clash of weapons, the hiss of frost meeting flame, the shrieks of men and monsters. War horns echoed across the plain. King Aegon's banner, a black field with a red dragon, waved alongside the direwolf of Stark and the sun and spear of Martell. In that swirling chaos, house loyalties dissolved into a single will to survive. Where another appeared, men fell swiftly unless they had dragonglass or Valyrian steel. One other engaged a cluster of Lannister knights, shattering their swords with icy contempt. It advanced on them, eyes burning with cold light, until a faintly glowing blade, a prized Valyrian steel sword from House Corbray, slashed in. The other recoiled, fracturing into ice shards. The knights exhaled in relief, then turned to face more wights that pressed in from behind. Elsewhere, a giant battered the living lines, swinging a massive tree trunk as a club. Dozens of men were crushed. Eventually, a group of archers aimed carefully with dragonglass arrows, peppering the giant's hide. With a bellow that shook the battlefield, it collapsed, its flesh disintegrating into dust. Pyres dotted the field as men hurled torches to prevent the fallen from rising again. Near the center, Rickon Stark led a vanguard of northern spearmen, forging a wedge into the undead masses. His direwolf Shaggy Dog, older and scarred, snarled and bit at wights, tearing them down. Connington's men, flanking on the left, fought to keep the wedge from being surrounded. The chaos was overwhelming. One could only see a few yards in any direction through the swirl of snow and the press of bodies. On the right flank, the Dornish cavalry led by Sir Dagos Fowler attempted a mounted charge, but the ground was slick with ice and corpses. Many horses slipped. Yet the Dornish persevered, using torches and spears to carve a path through the wights. Fire became their ally, though the cold wind from the others threatened to snuff it out. Above, the watchers on the wall launched barrages of pitch and arrows whenever the undead came within range. King Aegon himself was in the thick of it, refusing to remain behind lines. Armed with a Valyrian steel sword rumored to have once belonged to his ancestor Rhaegar, he fought with surprising skill, though he was not the realm's best swordsman. A ring of realm-sworn knights guarded him, men from various houses who had sworn to keep the king alive at all costs. They formed a mobile bulwark, pressing forward step by step. A cluster of others emerged before them, 4 in total, each brandishing a blade of ice. The knights braced, knowing the slightest misstep meant death. Aegon, heart-pounding, recalled every lesson hammered into him. He parried an inhumanly swift strike from one other, feeling the cold bite that numbed his arm even through his gauntlet. Another knight lunged from the side with an obsidian-tipped spear, shattering the other's torso into a spray of frost. The others whirled, their eyes blazing, and the swirl of steel and ice continued. One by one the others fell, though 2 knights lay dead as well. Aegon remained standing, breath ragged in the freezing air, pressing on. Hours passed like years. The sun rose, barely piercing the gray sky, then sank again into twilight. The battlefield sprawled in all directions, a relentless churn of snow, blood, and the stench of decay. Some pockets of living men were isolated and overrun. Others rallied to break the undead lines. Over time, the living's discipline and weaponry began to tell. The undead, despite their vast numbers, could be felled with dragon glass and fire. Valyrian steel carved through them. The others themselves, relatively few, struck swiftly but retreated when threatened by concerted resistance. Slowly, the living forced the whites back. Yet the cost was unspeakably high. Thousands perished, many more grievously wounded. The ground was so thick with corpses that it was hard to find footing. Bonfires raged across the plain, incinerating the fallen to ensure they did not rise again. At what felt like the final hour, a horn blast resonated across the field. The watchers on the wall cheered, pointing to the eastern horizon. Reinforcements had arrived, latecomers from the Vale, led by knights who had braved a perilous route around the mountains. They slammed into the undead's flank with a ferocity that scattered the whites. The others, sensing the turning tide, withdrew once more, gliding away into the snowstorm. The whites that remained, stripped of their master's controlling presence, lurched aimlessly and were cut down or burned. At last, near the charred remnants of a battered palisade, the living realized the field was theirs. The final stand of the others had been driven back. Night fell. The howling wind carried no more horns. Mournful cries of the wounded echoed. King Aegon, bruised and bloody, knelt among the corpses, tears freezing on his cheeks as he surveyed the cost. Rickon Stark emerged, battered, his arm in a sling, eyes hollow with exhaustion. Thousands of men from every region lay dead or dying. This was war on a scale beyond the War of the Five Kings, yet it had been a war of united defense, not a realm tearing itself apart. The survivors gathered at makeshift aid stations, lighting torches in the swirling darkness. Maesters and septons moved among the fallen, offering what comfort they could. No one shouted victory. It felt more like a desperate reprieve from annihilation. Ravens flew south with messages that the others had been turned back. A great wave of relief washed over the Seven Kingdoms. The dreadful possibility that the undead might overrun the realm receded, at least for the moment. Some asked if this meant the threat was ended forever. The wise counseled caution. The others were ancient, patient, and might bide their time for another opportunity. But for now, the living had proven that unity could hold the darkness at bay. The memory of that alliance, forged in the fires of war, would long linger in the hearts of Westeros folk. In the aftermath, King Aegon and the Great Council orchestrated a massive effort to bury or burn the dead, rebuild the shattered outposts, and care for the wounded. Families mourned, lost sons, daughters, fathers, and mothers. The realm had been bled, yet it had not collapsed into chaos. Instead, the traditions of the Martell peace guided a new sense of shared identity. War monuments were erected near the wall, inscribed with the sigils of every house that had contributed. A battered standard of House Martell, discovered among the carnage, was placed in a seat of honor beside the Stark direwolf, the Targaryen dragon, the Lannister lion, and the rest, symbolizing the victory that unity had achieved. Stories spread south of how men from House Bolton had saved men from House Tully, how knights of House Dane had fought side by side with men from House Mormont, how a knight from the Iron Islands had rescued a Reach Lord from a swarm of whites. Bits of the old grudges dissolved in the shared grief and triumph. When the winter finally began to recede some months later, the realm embarked on a slow path of recovery. Roads needed clearing, farmland replanting, houses rebuilding. But the heartbeat of unity continued. The Great Council, having proven its worth in crisis, retained its structure, ensuring that each region's voice was heard in the rebuilding process. House Martell, though far to the south, remained integral, facilitating trade and sending relief to the hardest-hit parts of the north. Arianne Martell, receiving the final tallies of the war's losses, ordered a memorial to be constructed in Sunspear for Dornishmen who perished at the wall. She also ensured that regular caravans carried fresh supplies to King's Landing, which dispatched them north. For generations to come, minstrels would sing of the day House Martell mediated a realm-wide truce that not only ended the vicious cycle of civil wars, but also united the Seven Kingdoms against the ancient threat of the others. They would recount how swords were laid down in Sunspear, so that a new, grander fight could one day be won against a foe that threatened all living beings. They would tell tales of Aegon VI, the once contested king who proved his worth on the snowy plains, and of Sansa Stark, whose wisdom and resilience held the North together. They would tell of how wards raised in each other's lands became the leaders of a new generation, forging bonds that outlasted the darkest of nights. And always, at the heart of these stories, they would recall Prince Doran Martell, the quiet architect who, without brandishing a sword, shaped the destiny of a realm. Thus, in a land that had once drowned in blood for crowns and thrones, a radiant new legend took root. The legend of a kingdom that discovered its strength not through conquest, but through unity, and turned that unity into a shield against the greatest darkness any mortal could imagine. When the snows melted and the sun shone once more on the fields and deserts of Westeros, many believed that while men might yet war among themselves in centuries to come, they would never again let old hatreds blind them to the threats that loomed beyond their borders. And so it was said, whenever the caravans rolled down the King's Road, or the sails of a trading ship unfurled at the harbor, or a raven soared overhead bearing tidings of births and weddings, that in forging a lasting peace among the great houses, House Martell had given Westeros more than a respite from war. They had given it the means to endure, come what may. And in that gift lay hope for every soul who walked under the same sky, from the wall's frozen ramparts to the sun-scorched spires of Sunspear.